He was trekking down a mountain path, carrying his little sister on his back. Just 12 years old, Yuri locked her thin arms around his neck and kept completely quiet. She couldn't see the gray rocks all around them, nor the heavy fog and the hazy trail under their feet. She'd actually been blind since birth, but she could feel her brother's heartbeat, steady and calm, kind of like a metronome, or a hammer striking an anvil. And as long as it kept beating like that, she knew everything was going to be just fine. John Gang-hyuk didn't glance back. He didn't pause, and he didn't cut himself any slack. His sister was riding on his back, a sack filled with her mother's tools. Slung over his shoulder and tucked in his pocket was the deed to the deserted Chalgok mine. That was literally all he took from the Cheon clan. 17 whole years of his life, reduced to a single bag and one scrap of paper. 2 days back, the leader of the Cheon clan, Mugon, called him into the council chambers. Gang-hyuk stood before a long table crafted from dark wood. The senior masters were seated around it, while his father stood at the front, tall with broad shoulders and hands that could bend an iron rod. With his bare fingers, Mugon didn't even look at him. He stared straight through him, like he was just empty space. He declared that the girl, Yuri, had been deemed a liability to the family. Blind, lacking mana, and totally skillless, just useless to the clan. She was going to be sent to a home for disabled kids. Over in the capital, Gang-hyuk just listened, squeezing his fists together so hard that his fingernails sliced right into his palms, sending blood dripping down his fingers. Yet he stayed put, wondering if he could bring his sister along. For the very first time, Mugyong stared straight at him for a long moment, then warned that if Gang-hyuk left with her, there'd be no coming back, ever. Self-imposed exile, branded as a total traitor, stripping his family name, losing all workshop access, losing absolutely everything. Gang-hyuk bowed, turned around, and walked away. An hour later, he was already carrying Yuri down the hallway, heading out the back exit past the workshops, where he'd hauled coal and scrubbed furnaces for 2 whole years, past the active forges, where the ringing of hammers echoed out, past the room where his older brother, Chan Muyong, was shaping another blade in the white-hot flames. Muyong caught sight of him through the open door, stretching his hammer to a halt, glancing at Yuri on Gang-hyuk's back, and then at his tool bag, giving a smirk, mocking that the low-tier tinkerer had finally found himself some real work, fixing up old chairs around the village. Gang-hyuk didn't say a word. Yuri, clinging to his back, squeezed a bit tighter, hearing every single thing, just like she always did. The second brother, Chun Mayan, waited by the entrance without any mockery, handing Gang-hyuk a small pack, stuffed with some crackers and jerky, enough for a 3-day trek. Mayan said it was just so he wouldn't starve out there, since that'd bring shame upon the family name. Gang-hyuk took the provisions, gave a slight nod, and passed through the entryway, the heavy doors shutting behind him with a dull, metallic thud. Yuri softly leaned in to whisper, muttering that those gates kind of slammed shut like a heavy chest lid, and that was pretty much it. Gang-hyuk just nodded, knowing she was right. For a couple of days, he kept trekking along the mountain paths of Sobak province. Yuri just rode along quietly on his back, only asking for a bit of water now and then, or sometimes just drifting off to sleep. Whenever she dozed off, he'd pick up the pace. But the moment she woke up, he'd slow down so he wouldn't jostle her. By the time evening rolled around on day 2, the path started sloping upward as the trees began thinning out. Barren, gray crags took over while the air turned crisp and thin. As Yuri shivered, Gang-hyuk pulled off his heavy outer coat and wrapped it right around her, prompting her to ask if he was freezing. He just told her that blacksmiths never really get cold, since his skin still remembers the warmth of the forge. Honestly, it was a total lie. He was freezing, but seeing Yuri smile made it totally worth it. Right around sundown, the mouth of the Chagak mine came into view, just a pitch-black opening in the stone. The old timber archway framing the entrance had rotted away and was tilting precariously. The tracks headed straight inside, vanishing into the darkness, with broken-down mine carts left strewn all over the place. There were rusted iron rods and shattered bits of stone, and wild weeds had cropped up right through the rocky ground. The whole place felt completely dead, deserted, and forgotten, like it had been 40 years since anyone last set foot inside. Yuri softly asked if they'd finally made it, so Gang-hyuk gently lowered her down to the dirt, standing completely barefoot on the rough gravel. She winced a little and caught a whiff of the air, noticing that it smelled like iron, damp earth, and stuff that's been aged for ages. Gang-hyuk just stared blankly at the entrance, at the caved-in shafts, the corroded tracks, and the sheer void. And absolutely nobody could call his talent garbage. Grabbing Yuri by the hand, they headed inside. The initial passageway was partly caved in, with a ceiling that had sloped downward. The rotten support timbers drooped like shattered ribs. Gainiac sparked a flint to light a torch of oil-soaked rags. The glow exposed walls covered with streaks of rust, puddles on the ground, and a nest of rats. Gear was strewn right along the sides, pickaxes, shovels, and mallets. Everything had rusted out. Everything was just dead. Yuri strolled right beside him, grazing the wall with her fingers. She kept track of her paces. After 120 steps, the corridor opened up. They stepped out into a cavern the size of a large room. The ceiling was way up high, and the air felt a bit drier. An old, worn workbench stood over in the corner. Right nearby lay the masonry of what, had previously been a mine. It had completely crumbled, but the base stayed solid. Kanyak came to a halt, scanning the space around him. This used to be his mother's old studio. She had done her craft here, long before becoming the mistress to the Chun clan's leader, back before giving birth to Kong Hyuk, and before everything kind of went south. He dropped the sack down onto the workbench, loosened the knot, and pulled out the gear. His mom's favorite hammer, some pliers, a bundle of chisels, and a T-square. Every single bit was carefully bound in oiled cloth, and all of it remained in pristine shape. See, he had cleaned and oiled them every month. Throughout those 2 years, it was the sole thing he used his talents for. While staying at the Chana estate, Yuri reached out for the edge of the table, tracing her fingers along the rough wood. Lifting her hand up to catch the scent, she noted it smelled like oil, iron dust, and stuff like that, reminding him of her mom's hands. Kanyak quietly set up the gear, and then went to gather rocks for a makeshift fireplace. They needed a fire, they needed to get warm, and they needed some light. Come morning, he'd go deal with the mine. But right now, they just had to make it through their first night. He built up a fire using scraps from the old supports. The timber was dry and blazed up hot. Yuri sat close by, holding her hands out toward the flames. She smiled, saying how cozy and warm it felt. Gang Hyuk sat right down next to her, placing his mother's hammer by his side. The torch was finally dying out. The campfire crackled, while somewhere deep inside the mine, water kept dripping in a steady rhythm, sounding like a hammer striking an anvil. Yuri was the first to drift off. Ganya just sat there, watching the flames, before looking down at his own hands, so big and rough, heavily calloused from 7 years of blacksmithing. He clenched and opened his fingers. These hands really only knew how to do one thing. The whole world kept telling him it was a waste of time, saying that mending stuff was just grunt work, and that a true smith is supposed to create, not just fix things up. Maybe everyone else is right, or maybe the world just hasn't seen what real restoration can actually do. We'll find out in the morning. He drifted off to sleep. Morning in the mine started with a bitter chill. The fire had completely gone out. Yuri was huddled up tight under Ganya's coat, her breath visible in the frosty air. Shivering, Ganya tried stretching out his hands, but his fingers were totally stiff from the cold. He blew on them to warm them up. Then he squeezed and relaxed them a few times. Blood coursed through his body. The priority is checking out the mine. The whole place, every single shaft, every corner to see what's in there. What could be handy and what's risky. He let Yuri sleep and headed on in, holding a flashlight in his left hand and his mom's hammer in his right. Just out of habit, not for protection. He kind of thought better with a hammer in hand. The first shaft went on for around 200 meters. The roof was pretty low, the beams were decaying. Every 20 paces, or so, he'd spot some gear. A pickaxe resting against the wall. A shovel sitting in a puddle. An old dumped wheelbarrow with a busted wheel. Folks walked away from here 40 years back, and left with nothing but themselves. Everything else just stayed behind, rusting and rotting. A cave-in was waiting at the end of the first tunnel. The roof had caved right in. Boulders blocked the whole way, but some air was drifting from past the debris, meaning there was an open space back there. That was a plus. The second tunnel veered left. It actually turned out to be broader. The tracks here were in way better shape. Ganyak brushed his hand over the oxidized track. The surface was eaten away, but the core was sturdy. Solid steel. The second path brought him to some water. A subterranean creek, crystal clear and freezing. Ganyak grabbed a quick handful of it. He tried it, and there wasn't any weird taste. It was safe to drink, which took care of the water issue. The third route headed further down. A sharp drop-off, and the tracks here were ripped up. Something massive had rolled over them a while ago, tearing them right out of the ties. Ganyak didn't go down there, not yet. After checking the top floors, he went back to Yuri. She wasn't sleeping anymore. She was sitting right by the dead fire. Her hands were resting on her knees, and her head was kind of tilted to the side. She was listening closely and asked where he'd been. Ganyak gave her a quick rundown. 3 tunnels, and there's water. There's some tools and piles of rubble, too. Yuri gave a nod and asked what they were going to eat. Hyuk opened up the bundle from On. He snapped the hardtack right in half and handed her the bigger piece. She just took it without arguing. She took a bite, chewing it real slowly, then mentioned that the hardtack tasted great. Hyuk knew the stuff was actually hard as a rock. But Yuri always said the food was delicious. It was just her habit, a little white lie to make things a bit easier, you know? Once they finished eating, he got to work. The very first thing to fix up was the forge. Without fire, you can't have a smithy. Without a forge, there's no way to work. And without work, there isn't any food. The masonry of the forge had fallen apart, but the stones were all still there. He gathered them up and puzzled them together, sealing the gaps with mud from the water table. By midday, the forge was standing kind of rough. A little crooked, but it did the trick. Next, he needed fuel. Way back at the end of the second tunnel, he tracked down a coal store, a pretty small one, maybe 10 tons. The coal had hardened into a solid block, but it was still coal. Hyuk packed a sackful and hauled it over to the furnace. He sparked it up, the first fire in this mine for 40 years. The flame was pretty weak, and the coal barely burned after decades of sitting idle. But the furnace was finally warming up. Those rocks were getting pretty hot. The mine kind of came to life, and Yuri looked up. She whispered, saying she could hear the stone crackling from the heat, almost like it was talking. Hyuk just nodded, even though she couldn't actually see him. Then he realized what he was doing, so he said out loud that, yeah, the rock really was talking. Now, for the next step, tools. He had his mom's, but there just weren't enough. He needed more, so he walked down the first tunnel and scavenged whatever he could find. 4 pickaxes in pretty rough shape, 3 hammers, a shovel missing its handle, a bunch of rail spikes, some rusty scrap metal, and one particular item that made him stop right there. It was a miner's hammer, huge and heavy. Its stained oak handle was definitely fractured, but not totally broken. The head was buried under a thick layer of rust. But underneath all that, the shape was flawless, elegant. This wasn't some mass-produced tool, you know? Someone had hand-forged it with real care. Hyuk carried the hammer over to the workbench and set it down right in front of him. He stared at it, running his fingers across the head, then closed his eyes as his ability kicked in. Master blacksmith? Nah, just a basic repair skill. The simple power to mend damaged items back to the way they used to be. At least, that's what the registry stated. That's what they told him at the awakening ceremony 2 years back. The appraiser from the Imperial Magic Bureau checked out the result, glanced at Hyuk, and softly told him he was sorry. A mere D-rank skill, utility repair and restoration. His older brothers were standing right behind the official. Mayan didn't even try to hide his smirk, while Mayun just looked away. His dad hadn't shown up to the ceremony for 2 years. Hyuk had been using his ability to fix up gear in various workshops, busted pliers, fractured molds, and blunt chisels. Nobody ever thanked him, and nobody even noticed. Fixes are invisible, you know? People only care about what's brand new. Hyuk gripped a miner's hammer in his hands. It had like 40 years of rust, cracks, and decay on it. He triggered his skill, and a soft radiance beamed from his palms. White, gentle, and warm. The corrosion started fading away, almost like time was moving backward. Brown flakes peeled right off and drifted down onto the workbench. The fractures in the handle mended themselves, though it straightened out and regained its rich color. The striking face was completely purged, and the metal gleamed. Hyuk waited for the power to wrap up. Usually, a ruined item just becomes whole again, period. But this time, the skill didn't stop. The glow intensified, getting much hotter. Hyuk could feel a shift happening. The hammer in his hands began to vibrate. The metal on the head compressed, densifying as the steel's internal grain completely restructured itself. Hyuk couldn't actually see this with his eyes. He just sensed it through his ability. The crystalline lattice of the metal was shifting, and all the flaws were vanishing. The tiny imperfections that had plagued the hammer, ever since it was forged, were totally gone. The handle became flawlessly smooth. Its center of gravity shifted, making the balance absolutely perfect. The tool settled right into his grip, feeling just like an extension of his own hand. The ability deactivated, and Hyuk opened his eyes. The hammer he was holding was definitely not the same one he'd scavenged from the tunnel. It was better, way better. It was the ideal hammer, exactly how the blacksmith who crafted it 60 years ago had originally envisioned it. It was the hammer, just like it was at its absolute prime, right when the steel had finally cooled down, after the master's ultimate strike, before it had even seen a single day of work. Flawless and perfect. Hyuk picked it up, testing its weight in his hand, and struck the anvil. A resonant chime reverberated through the tunnel, clear and long, just like a bell. Yuri shivered, mentioning that the sound was beautiful, that she'd never heard such pure-sounding metal. Hyuk stood there frozen. He gazed at the hammer, suddenly understanding. The ability hadn't just fixed it. The ability had completely restored it to the finest state in the object's entire history. It wasn't a reset to its original form, you know? It was a return to its true form, to the ideal version of how the item was meant to be. Gagnac took a seat on a boulder, resting the hammer on the anvil. He just stared at it for a long while. Then, he softly muttered to himself. They were all wrong. Every single one of them. Getting up, he grabbed the next pickaxe. He triggered the ability, and the rust washed away like water. During that first week, Gagnac renewed 23 tools. Every single time, the Tier 2 ability worked the same way. The rust melted off, the fractures sealed up. The metal grew tougher, and the object ended up better than ever. 4 pickaxes turned out sharper than brand new ones. 3 hammers achieved a kind of flawless balance. They hadn't even possessed the day they were forged. The shovel got an edge harder than tempered steel. Each item rang differently after being fixed, cleaner, brighter. Yuri sat by the hearth and listened. She actually began telling the notes apart. She remarked that the first pickaxe had a kind of low bass tone. The next was louder than the third, like a real high-pitched crack. Honestly, couldn't tell how she could catch that, but she definitely heard it by the third day. He'd cleared out the entry to the first tunnel, of minor rubble with a solid pickaxe. The job moved kind of 3 times faster now, since the stones gave way pretty easily. He wasn't able to swap out the support beams, since he needed timber and there wasn't any. So he figured out another way, stone columns. He gathered up rocks and piled the pillars high, then set some flat slabs right on top. Bit rough but solid, the roof stopped caving in. By the end of that first week, the primary tunnel was totally clear from end to end. Past all the debris lay a 4th cavern, huge with a really high ceiling, and filled with discoveries that made Gagnac freeze. Weapons, not digging gear, you know. Actual weapons. 5 swords, a pair of axes, a spear with a snapped handle, and a shield. All of them ancient, totally covered in rust, and completely left behind. Someone had stored these here, or maybe stashed them away. Gagnac picked up the very first blade. Heavy, with a really wide edge. A classic old imperial-style, foot soldier's sword. 70 years old, maybe even older than that. 70 years old, maybe even older than that. Any regular blacksmith would have just tossed it into the furnace. Gagnac pressed his hand against the flat of the metal, triggering his ability. A soft light flickered. The corrosion started melting off, the steel shifted, and right then, something totally new occurred. Gagnac actually perceived information. Not through spoken words, and not in pictures either. Just pure intuition. Like warmth. He could literally feel the heat. Where this blade was crafted. 1,300 degrees on the dot. No doubt about the makeup either. Carbon steel blended with chromium. The exact ratio just came to him. For percent chromium. Next, the rhythm of the forge. A blow. A pause. Then 2 rapid strikes. A quick turn, and another blow. The master used a triple beat pace. A pretty rare method. Then came the oil quenching, tempered in oil that was preheated to 60 degrees. Gunhook opened his eyes. The sword in his hands was fully restored. The blade was gleaming, its edge razor sharp. But that wasn't the biggest deal. What really mattered was that Gunhook now understood exactly how this blade was made. Every single step, every little detail, as if he'd been standing right behind the artisan, just watching. He picked up the second sword, triggered his ability, and saw a new master. A whole new temperature. 1,280 degrees. A different blend, a different pace. A double strike paired with a draw. Quenched in water mixed with salt. The third blade was something else entirely. Gunhook fixed up all 5 swords, plus 2 axes, a spear, and a shield. Each piece passed along to him. A complete breakdown of how it was forged. 9 pieces of gear, 9 unique styles, from 9 different craftsmen. Leaning back against the wall, he closed his eyes. Now he had 9 ways to forge a weapon locked in his mind. 9 heat levels, 9 distinct alloy recipes, and 9 patterns for the hammer. He'd grown up around the Chan clan's workshops, and for over 2 years, he'd watched the clan's finest smiths do their thing. Yet, he only knew 3 forging styles, 3 deemed state-of-the-art, the finest within 10 minutes inside an empty tunnel. He'd picked up 9, and a few were way better than anything he'd seen. Back in the Chan clan, those old anonymous smiths crafted stuff differently. Not like how they teach nowadays. Gang Hayek couldn't quite put the difference into words, but he could feel it. The older methods had more depth, more accuracy, more complexity. It's like the masters from 70 years back understood something about metalwork that today's smiths had kind of forgotten. Yuri called out to him, mentioning he'd been sitting there quiet for way too long. So she was starting to get worried. Kong Ho got up and carried the blades over to the bench. Setting them out, right before the furnace. Yuri caught a scent and asked what that smell was. Kon-hik answered that it smelled like steel. Really good steel. Yuri noted that every blade has its own unique scent. Kon-hyuk bent down toward the metal. Taking a sniff, she was right, you know. Each type of alloy possessed its own odor. Faint, almost unnoticeable. He hadn't caught it earlier, but Yuri did. By the second week, Kon-hyuk properly started working alongside the miner. Their primary goal was clearing out the second tunnel from end to end. To do that, he required the ultimate gear. Nothing refurbished, but built completely from scratch. He resolved to forge a brand new pickaxe. His very own, his first one ever. Applying the insights gained from those 9 repairs. As for supplies, he tore down the corroded tracks from the first tunnel. High-quality carbon steel, which he melted down in the fire. Monitoring the heat strictly by ear. Once the metal rings at a certain pitch, it's hit 1,300 degrees. When the tone shifts, you know it's at 1,400. Kon-hyuk's hearing was flawless. After a decade at the forge, the metal lay ready on the anvil. Kon-hyuk grabbed the hammer, that exact one, the restored miner's tool from 60 years ago. He closed his eyes, delivering the first strike. The echoing chime reverberated through the tunnel. Yuri glanced up as the second strike landed. Then the third. He shaped it using the original master's triple rhythm. A strike, a brief pause, 2 rapid hits, and a turn. Next, he adopted the second master's method. A drawn-out strike with a swift recoil. The metal flattened out, stretching thin. As it hardened, he switched over to the fifth master style. A 2-step process. First water, then oil. The final piece wasn't perfect, but it'd do just fine for a pickaxe. The tool was fully crafted in 3 hours. Kon-hyuk inspected it. Honestly, it beat any pickaxe he'd ever spotted in the Chun clan's workshops. Not because he was some legendary smith, but because he'd taken the finest traits from different experts and fused them together. One knew the heat, another mastered the tempo, and a third understood the tempering phase. None of them grasped the whole picture, but Kon-hyuk did. Yuri asked about that peculiar noise, mentioning that the hammer seemed to be singing. Not just clanging, but genuinely singing, kind of like it was conversing with the metal. Kon-hyuk stared down at the pickaxe, then at the blades resting against the wall, and finally at his palms. He murmured that he required more. More ancient weaponry, more discarded tools, and more oxidized scrap. Every item is an instructor, you know? Every shattered blade is a lesson to learn. He requires scraps, basically any trash he can track down. Yuri mentioned. It was the very first time she'd ever seen a guy celebrate. Over garbage. Kon-hyuk actually grinned for the first time in a couple of weeks. By the time the first month wrapped up, the Chagik mine was completely transformed. Kon-hyuk put in 14-hour workdays. He slept for 5 and spent the rest of his hours either metalworking or clearing debris. The initial tunnel had been turned into a storeroom, where the rocks were piled up neatly along the walls. The tracks were fully restored, and the fixed-up mine cart rolled smoothly right over them, with a soft, metallic rattle. The second tunnel became their living quarters. Kon-hyuk finished the walls using smooth stones, and put together 2 beds from broken timber salvaged from mine. He routed a channel from the subterranean creek, so fresh water ran right into their room. Yuri didn't need to wander far. She managed their household stuff. Unable to see, she got around using sound and memory. In just a week, she recognized every single rock, each bend, and every single step. She moved through the mine with total confidence, without using a cane or needing any help. Lightly brushing the wall with her right hand, she'd count her strides. A left turn after taking 32 steps, a right after 48, and a step downward after 61. She never made a mistake. Kon-hyuk set up his blacksmith shop in the 4th cavern. The high overhead space offered great ventilation, allowing the smoke to vent out through natural fissures in the stone. He managed to carve an anvil out of solid block of granite, pretty crude and temporary, but it did the job. He also hooked up some bellows to the hearth, which he'd stitched together from the leather of old burlap sacks. He found in the mine kind of primitive stuff, but as they fed it air, the fire blazed steady and hot. In a single month, Kon-hyuk fixed up 37 different tools, weapons, and even random household stuff. An old frying pan, an oil lamp, a door hinge, each piece passed on some knowledge. Not every single one gave him much, you know. Mass-produced goods didn't reveal a whole lot. Just heat levels and rhythm, nothing more. But those rare, one-of-a-kind handmade items, crafted with real skill, truly spoke. They shared stories about their makers, long-lost techniques, and the hidden secrets of the metal. 37 pieces yielded 21 unique methods. Kon-hyuk didn't write them down on paper. There wasn't any paper around. It was all his head. He committed it to memory straight through his hands. He practiced every method on a test piece. Once his body locked it in and his hands remembered, he finally started forging actual weapons. He crafted his very first sword using recycled railroad tracks. It was carbon steel and not exactly top-shelf quality, but his sheer technique made up for the materials he used. He applied the third master's heat management, the seventh master's hammering rhythm, and the 12th's tempering style. He based the blade's outline on what he knew about standard infantry swords, except he made the blade longer and a bit narrower. He hammered away for 3 full hours. It took 240 strikes to get the rough shape and another 160 to smooth it out. Then 40 more for sharpening, followed by a 2-stage hardening process. He tempered it at 400 degrees and let it cool in the air. The final sword turned out pretty basic. No fancy decorations, no engravings, and no name. Just a straight blade, 70 centimeters long, single-edged, and weighing just about 1 kilo and 100 grams. Hyuk picked it up, testing his grip. As he swung it, the blade sliced through the air with a whistle. It felt kind of light, yet remarkably rigid at the same time. The center of gravity was balanced right down toward the hilt. Quite comfy for an extended fight. It didn't strain his wrist. He hit a rock. Gently, just a test swing. Not even a scratch on the edge. He swung harder, and the stone cracked open. Yet the blade remained flawless. Hyuk was well aware of the Chun clan's standard-issue blades, since he'd handled them for a couple of years, cleaning them, fixing them up, and sharpening them. One of those standard Chun clan weapons would run you about 20 gold pieces. They were typically bought by mid-tier hunters and soldiers from the Imperial Army. They were decent weapons, but the sword Hyuk had just crafted out of melted-down railway tracks was way better, and not just by a little bit. It was noticeably sharper and lighter. Plus, he'd whipped it up in 3 hours using scrap metal. Hyuk set the blade down on his bench, took a seat, and wiped his face. His hands reeked of steel and coal dust. Yuri walked over and passed him water in a tin cup. He'd patched up the previous week. She asked if things had turned out all right, and Hyuk replied that it worked out. Yuri then asked if it was actually a good sword. Hyuk stayed quiet for a moment, then muttered that he wasn't sure. He needed someone to give it a test run, someone who actually fights for a living. 3 days later, he headed out to Chortawan, which was a 4-hour trek down a mountain path. It was a tiny mining town of maybe 4,000 residents, where half of the houses stood deserted. The mines had shut down, so jobs were scarce, and the younger crowd had all moved to the capital. Only the elderly and folks with nowhere else to go were left behind. There were 10 storefronts in the market square, but 3 were boarded up. Hyuk strolled past an armory and glanced inside at the dusty counters. Inexpensive, factory-made blades carrying the Bet clan's crest, going for 12 gold coins each, the absolute bottom tier. The shopkeeper, this gray-bearded old guy, stared at Hyuk, noticing his sun-baked hands and his rough, weathered leather apron. He asked what he was looking for. Hyuk set his weapon down on the counter, mentioning that he was looking to sell it. The old man picked up the blade, lifting it toward the light. He flipped it over and ran a finger along the edge, cutting himself and letting out a curse. Glancing at Hyuk, he asked who had crafted it. Hyuk claimed he did, but the old guy didn't buy it. He inspected the blade once more. No maker's mark, no house insignia, no name at all. He asked for the price. Hyuk requested 7 gold pieces. The old man gaped at him like he'd lost his mind, stating the weapon was worth at least 30. Hyuk shook his head, insisting on 7. He just needed cash for food and provisions, not for any kind of luxury. The shopkeeper bought it right then and there, handing over 10 pieces instead. He remarked that paying 7 insulted a blade like that, and his own conscience wouldn't let him do it. Hyuk took the cash and purchased rice flour, cooking oil and salt, along with leather for new quivers, cords, and candles, plus 5 blocks of low-grade iron. It wasn't premium stuff, but it's going to work for practice. Heading back home, he reflected, 10 gold coins for a sword forged from junk. A standard, assembly line blade from the Chun clan runs about 20, and it's lower quality. If he makes 2 swords every week, that brings in 20 gold pieces. With that kind of cash, he and Yuri could easily get by for a month. And honestly, he could craft things faster, better, and cheaper, provided he tracked down decent materials, rather than the train tracks. He headed back to the mine. Yuri was just waiting by the entrance. She'd always head out to the entrance whenever he was gone. For a really long time, she'd stand there and listen, waiting to hear his footsteps. She could recognize his stride from like 200 meters away. Heavy, steady, with a bit of a shuffle from his right foot. She mentioned he kind of smelled like rice, and that she was just so happy. Later that night, Hyuk whipped up their first proper dinner in a month. Just rice with some butter and salt. Yuri ate it up and said it was the best food in the world. Ganyak knew it was nothing but rice and butter, but for the first time all month, he felt like they actually had a shot to do more than survive, to really live. 2 weeks after that first sale, an old man showed up at the mine. Ganymede caught the sound of heavy footsteps at the entrance, uneven and crunching against the small stones. He grabbed a hammer and stepped outside. Standing right there at the entry was a man around 60, broad-shouldered and bow-legged. His face was darkened by the sun and caked in grain dust, with hands that looked like 2 pieces of weathered leather. His eyes were small, sharp, and full of life. He stared at Ganyak, then over the mine opening, then back at Ganyak, introducing himself as Pak Dolsu. He mentioned he'd worked right here in this mine 40 years back, and that he'd heard down in Chorwan that some kid had reopened Chalgok, so he'd come out to see for himself. Ganyak didn't say a word. Dolsu just brushed past him and headed inside, without even asking for permission. Ganhyuk followed him in. The old man started walking down the main tunnel, talking softly to himself. He felt the walls and knocked on the supports. He crouched down toward the ground. He caught a whiff of the air. He knew this whole mine inside and out, every single bend and fracture. Once they emerged into the 4th room, and Dulsway spotted the hearth, along with the anvil and a workspace full of gear. He froze right in his tracks. Then he faced Ganhyuk and demanded to know what his business was there. Ganhyuk replied that he was smithing. Dulsway scoffed, saying that much was obvious. But he questioned why some kid would be crafting blades all alone in an abandoned mine. It was either total craziness or there was a hidden motive. Ganhyuk didn't even bother explaining stuff. Instead, he locked his eyes onto Dulsway's hands, noticing the pickaxe hooked on his waist. An ancient, heavily weathered tool, with its grip bound in metal cabling. He asked if he could check it out. Dulvey unclipped the tool and passed it over, with doubt, since he'd used that thing for 4 decades. Ganyak gripped it firmly. He shut his eyes and triggered his special aura. Dalsby leaped back and swore under his breath. Corrosion literally poured off the edge like a river. The wire binding dissolved underneath it all. The shaft was completely mended. The timber turned sleek and pale. The head gleamed as the iron toughened up. Its outline grew keener and way more refined. The magic went deeper, since the pickaxe wasn't factory-made. It was forged by a local metalworker half a century ago. A simple, rough artisan, but a dedicated one. He grasped the metal and mastered the weight distribution, poured the absolute peak of his craftsmanship into this tool, and the ability brought it right back to its prime status. Ganyak opened his eyes and extended the pickaxe once more. Dalsby took hold of it, his hands shaking. He gripped his pickaxe, finding it unrecognizable. He flipped it over in his grasp, clutched the shaft, and took a practice swing. Stopping mid-air, it fit his grip seamlessly like never before. Through 4 decades of labor, the tool had practically shaped itself to his hand. He thought he was familiar with its heft, its balance, and its overall feel. But right now, he was holding a totally different tool. The exact same piece of gear, yet altered. The version this pickaxe was truly meant to be. Since the very start, Dolphy stayed quiet for a whole minute. Then, he softly remarked that he'd been hacking away at stone with this very tool for 40 years, yet it had never once felt this good in his hands. He questioned what Ganhyuk had actually done to it. Ganhyuk replied with just a single word. Fixed. Dulsif stared back at him, then gave a shake of his head and said, no, you didn't just fix it. You made it what it was always supposed to be. Ganhyuk offered no reply. Dolphus took a seat on a stone near the forge, resting the pickaxe across his knees. He gently ran a hand down the shaft, then inquired if Ganyak had any need for a miner. Ganyak asked why, and Dulvey noted that this place was pretty massive. 3 full levels and dozens of shafts, with or veins that haven't even been fully cleared. Plus 1 kid who clearly has no clue where he's digging. He requires a guy who actually understands a stone. Someone who knows exactly where the iron is, and where the useless rock is. Someone who can tell which walls are safe to strike, and which ones are going to cave in at the slightest nudge. Ganyak asked what he expected to get in return. Tolsway cast his gaze down at the pickaxe. He mentioned he was up there in years, and his wife passed a decade ago. His kids all moved away to the capital, so he's just living by himself in Chorwan. He drinks, he sleeps, he just waits. And then, out of nowhere, someone's doing real work in his mind with his rocks. And they're doing a great job, you know? He wants to work too. Just keep working for as long as his legs can carry him. Ganyak agreed, so Dalsway stuck around. That exact same day, he went to crash in the living quarters on that 3rd cot that Ganyak had thrown together. Within an hour, he was snoring so hard the whole cave was practically shaking. Yuri joked that they basically had their own mountain spirit now. Super loud and smelling like tobacco. With Dalsway on board, the work moved 3 times faster. The old man really knew his stone. He knew exactly where to strike, and where the veins ran deep or where they hit a dead end. Inside a week, he guided Ganhyuk all the way through the second tunnel. He pointed out 3 different iron ore deposits that the earlier miners had either overlooked or written off as low-grade, and they kind of were low-grade. The actual iron content was pretty low, but Ganhyuk didn't really care about rich or. He just needed any iron he could get to smelt it, purify it, and refine it. The methods passed down by ancient masters let him process low-grade stuff just as easily as high-quality or. The very first smelting of his own or happened around the 3rd week of the 2nd month. Ganhyuk put together a basic blast furnace using fire bricks, then packed it with or in coal. Dalsway pumped the bellows while Yuri kept the rhythm. She chilled near the chamber entrance and tapped a stone in a steady pattern. Tapping once every 3 seconds, this actually helped Ganhyuk keep the air supply perfectly steady. The smelting process took 6 hours. The outcome was pretty modest. 20 kilograms of unrefined iron full of impurities and slag, but it was their own metal from their very own mine. Ganhyuk worked it over again, purifying the metal through 5 rounds of forging. Every single pass drove out the slag, and each hammer blow packed the metal tighter. He'd actually inherited this refining method from the 4th master, an ancient technique, one that was long forgotten. Nowadays, blacksmiths rely on chemical purification, since it's way faster. But mechanical forging gives you a totally different result. The steel's grain becomes finer, denser, and a lot stronger. From those 20 kilograms of raw iron, he managed to yield 14 kilograms of high-grade steel. Ganhyuk crafted 4 swords from it in just a week, all following the exact same formula, kind of blending techniques from several masters. Yet, each blade turned out slightly different. He was testing things out. The first focused on raw power, the second on a sharp edge, and the third on perfect balance. The 4th one was his shot at bringing it all together. That 4th attempt turned out best of all. Ganhyuk tested its weight in his hand. Giving a nod, it was exactly what he was looking for. Dulcie asked if he could take a look, so Ganhyuk passed the blade over to him. The old man turned it around in his hands, flicking the edge of the blade with his thumbnail, and listening closely to the ring. Then he mentioned that while he wasn't a smith or a warrior, just a simple miner, he'd still handled plenty of weapons in his time, and this particular sword resonated like nothing he had ever heard in his life. Yuri, chiming in from her corner, remarked that the 4th sword sang way more clearly than the first 3. A high, beautifully sustained note, completely noise-free. Ganhyuk brought all 4 blades over to Chodwan. He headed back into that same shop. The elderly shopkeeper spotted him and stood right up. He mentioned he'd been waiting around, explaining that the initial sword Ganhyuk sold 2 weeks back had been purchased by a hunter. That hunter actually came back 3 days later, not to complain, but to ask a question. Where could he get his hands on more? He'd taken down a mountain wolf using that blade. With just a single blow, the edge sliced right through hide and bone, kind of like cutting through butter. The guy had honestly never seen anything like it before. Ganhyuk lined up the 4 swords on the shop counter. The old man carefully checked each one over, holding the 4th blade up against the light and inspecting it for a good while. Then he asked how much he wanted for them. Ganhyuk requested 7 gold pieces for each one. The old shopkeeper shook his head, though. He countered that he'd give him 10 for the first 3, and 15 just for the 4th one, seeing as that 4th piece wasn't just some standard weapon. It was crafted by a true master. Cunhead accepted the 45 gold pieces, and then he walked out of the store. Someone was out there waiting for him on the pavement. A young guy dressed in full hunting outfit. He wore leather armor, carried 2 daggers on his belt, and had a scar across his chin. He introduced himself, saying he was a hunter who bought that very first blade. Turns out his name's Ma Chun-sik, a solo hunter. He takes on contract work for the Chorten Guild, hunting down monsters out in the hills. Usually, he relies on swords made by the Beck clan, just cheap stuff that snaps after a month or so. But Kanyuk's weapon? It hadn't picked up a single nick in 2 full weeks. Ma Chun-sik wondered if he could place a custom sword order, specifically tailored to fit his grip, something weightier than usual, with an extended hilt meant for a 2-handed hold. Ganhyuk glanced down at the man's hands. They had long, massive fingers, with rough calluses from wielding weapons with both hands. He inquired about his height and weight, as well as his main fighting stance. Ma Chun-sik gave his answers, and Ganhyuk nodded, telling him to swing by the mine in 5 days. Ma Chun-sik asked what the damage would be. Gonghu could replit 15. Ma Chun-sik didn't try to bargain. He just shook hands and headed out. Ganhyuk made his way back toward the mine, doing the math in his head. 45 gold pieces for the 4 standard blades. plus another 15 for that custom piece. Making 60 gold pieces a month with that kind of cash. He could stock up on materials for 3 months down the line. He could get Yuri some things and secure a decent set of bellows for the workshop. Then he'd finally be able to craft stuff way faster and better. He picked up the pace. Yuri was already waiting out front. She caught the sound of his footsteps from 200 meters off, noticing that he was walking a whole lot quicker than usual. She asked if he brought back good news. Gang Hyuk confirmed it, making Yuri smile, though she mentioned that while he was out, someone else had dropped by, an old guy leaning on a cane. He'd been looking for directions to the blacksmith in Chaokok. Yuri pointed out the way, and he headed on in, so now he's just sitting near the hearth waiting. Gang Hyuk frowned a bit and stepped inside. Sure enough, a total stranger was resting by the forge. Looked to be around 50, dressed in some pretty pricey clothes, complete with a plush fur collar and caskin boots. He even had a gold band on his pinky finger. Definitely wasn't a local miner or a hunter. Probably a merchant, or maybe something worse. The unfamiliar man got to his feet and smiled. He introduced himself as Quan Tajin, the leader of the Red Horn Guild, the biggest broker in the Timu Empire's weapons market. Kanyak just stood frozen in the doorway. He'd heard that name back in the Chun clan's workshops. Always spoken with respect and a lot of caution. Quan Taizin controlled a third of every weapons deal in the Empire. He called all the shots on who to sell to, at what price, and exactly how much. Even the big clans had to reckon with him. Taijin lifted up his right hand, or well, what was left of it? A stump cut to the elbow, neatly wrapped up in silk. He said he got how it probably looked, like a wealthy guy hanging out in a dump. But he'd actually been a blacksmith himself, once. He lost his arm about 20 years back, during an accident at the forge. He hadn't so much as touched a hammer since, but he could still sort of feel the metal. And when someone brought him an unmarked blade, picked up in some backwater town called Chorwan, for just 10 gold pieces, he held it in his left hand, and just knew this sword wasn't forged by some average blacksmith. This blade was crafted by a real master. Taijin strolled over to the workbench. He checked out the tools, the glowing coals in the hearth, and the rough granite anvil. He shook his head and said that forging on stone was pretty barbaric, but the craftsmanship itself sure wasn't. So it wasn't about the anvil, it was all in the hands. He turned straight to Ganyak, cutting right to the chase, and pitched a contract. A totally exclusive deal. Absolutely everything. Ganyak crafts will go straight through the Red Horn Guild. Taijin handles all the raw materials, the logistics, the distribution, and protection from the clans. Gang Kayak takes 40% of the cuts. Gang Kayak doesn't say a word. Taijin then mentioned he recognized him, calling him Chong Kayak, a side branch's third son, an outcast with a gift the family saw as useless. Taijin insisted the clan got it wrong, claiming that in 5 years, Konhalt's going to be the best blacksmith around. It's not like he's just naturally more gifted, but because he's the only one studying, under deceased masters who are passing down to him, the secrets they took to their graves. No living mentor could ever teach him like that. Konyak questioned how he even knew about the ability. With a smile, Taijin said his web of spies was kinda bigger than the actual armies of some houses. He knows the talent is called Master Blacksmith. He knows the family just treated him like a tinkerer, and he knows they were totally mistaken, since the blades Konyak creates don't look anything like a tinkerer's work. Kong Hyok went quiet and pondered for a bit, before saying he needed to sleep on it. Taiji nodded and got to his feet. He walked toward the exit, pausing right at the door, and glanced back. He noted that weighing options was smart, but waiting around for too long probably wasn't the best idea either, because if word about the Chagik Smith reached him, others are going to catch wind of it real soon, too. And not everyone's showing up with a business deal. Some will show up with demands, and some won't even bother talking at all. Then he left, leaving Gang Kayak by the hearth. Yuri walked over and gently nudged his arm, asking who that guy was. Gang Kayak replied, he's someone looking to buy them out. Yuri asked if the price was high. Gan Hyuk answered that it was 60%. Yuri paused to think for a second. Then she pointed out that 60% meant 3/5, and that 3/5 of their output was just too much to give up for a mere promise of protection from some guy they were meeting for the very first time. Gan Hyuk nodded, knowing Yuri was right. She always processed things way faster than he did. Gan Hyuk didn't give Taijin an answer. Not the next day, and not even the following week. He just kept forging 2 swords every single day. Sometimes 3, if the quality of the material was good. Dulls we kept chipping away at the rock face, along the veins inside the second tunnel, and rolled the ore out in a minecart, over the newly repaired tracks. Yuri tracked exactly how much ore was dug up, how much coal they burned, how many swords were finished, and how many were sold, keeping it all in her head. Without writing a single note, she remembered figures. the way normal people recognize faces. By the middle of the second month, Ganhyuk had already sold 20 swords, all of them through the old man's shop in Chodwon, and each one for just 10 gold pieces. The old man grumbled that it was a total robbery, insisting that Ganhyuk was ripping himself off, and that blades like those were worth at least 30. Ganhyuk just shook his head, holding firm at 10. He wanted his weapons to be bought by folks who couldn't afford. The clan made stuff like lone hunters, town guards, and mercenaries from the foothills. People who put their lives on the line every day, wielding nothing but pieces of scrap metal, because a real weapon would cost them half a year's pay. Word traveled fast. Hunters from Chortawan told the hunters over in the neighboring villages, who passed it on, so by the end of the second month, people were lining up outside the old man's shop. First 10 people, then 20, and pretty soon, folks were heading right to the mine. Ganhyuk didn't turn them away, though. He just had them line up by the entrance and brought out the blades. People paid up and left. Nobody even tried to haggle. 10 gold pieces for a sword like that? One that could take down a mountain wolf in a single swing? That wasn't just a price. It was a total steal. Ma Chun-sik came by to pick up his custom blade. 5 days later, exactly as they'd agreed. Ganhyuk had crafted it just the way he wanted, 12 centimeters longer than your standard weapon. The hilt was lengthened to allow for a two-handed grip, and it weighed half a kilogram. Plus, the balance point was shifted forward to deliver heavier slashing blows. Chun-sik took the weapon, gave it 3 practice swings, and froze, his eyes going wide. He said it felt like the sword already knew where to strike, that his hand wasn't even guiding it, but just following along. He'd never held anything like it. Ganhyuk explained why, noting how he'd factored in Chun-sik's arm span, the width of his palm, his body weight, and his fighting stance, since every little detail alters the balance. He hadn't just forged a random blade. He had tailored it for one specific warrior. Chun-sik handed over 20 gold instead of 15. He insisted the extra cash wasn't a handout. But what was fair? Then a week later, he showed up again with 3 other hunters. They all wanted custom swords made exactly for their grip. Ganhyuk took on the commissions, measured them up, and asked about how they liked to fight. One of them favored thrusting attacks. Another favored overhead shoulder strikes, while the third fought with a pair of blades. 3 distinct styles to craft for. 3 distinct strategies. Ganhyuk spent a week smithing, getting 4 hours of sleep, so Yuri told him. She said he dropped dead before destroying the clans. That a sleep-deprived blacksmith is basically a blind blacksmith. Ganhyuk just shrugged her off, but after dropping a metal blank on his foot, because his hands were shaking from exhaustion, he actually listened and started sleeping 6 hours. Yuri kept tabs on him, and though she couldn't see him, she could hear him breathing. If he tried getting up ahead of schedule, she'd call out from the dark, telling him it was still way too early, and he just lied back down. By month 3, Ganhyuk had sold 50 swords. 200 gold pieces. He'd never seen that kind of cash before. The clan used to pay him 2 silver pieces a month just for sweeping the forges. 200 pieces of gold was like 6 months' salary for the senior master of the Chun clan, so he bought a real anvil. Heavy steel, weighing 120 kilograms. The 3 of them, Dalsoy, the wagon driver, and himself, hauled it on a cart from Chajwan. They set it up inside the 4th chamber. Ganhyuk struck it with his hammer, and the ring was long and resonant. It's a decent anvil, factory-made. Not clan-crafted, but it's tough. Yuri remarked that the anvil sounded like a bell. Grand and full-bodied, Ganhyuk purchased new bellows. Leather ones equipped with copper valves. Proper bellows, you know? Not that junk he'd cobbled together from old sacks. The forge finally started breathing evenly. The heat became more consistent, more accurate, and the swords were getting better. Right on the 51st blade, exactly what Ganhyuk had anticipated and dreaded went down. Dulvi brought over a shard from the 2nd shaft, which he'd uncovered inside the wall, 2 meters deep. The old guy was hacking away at the mineral vein when he suddenly hit something solid, super solid. The pickaxe screeched and just deflected right off. So he chipped out a fist-sized piece of stone and carried it over to Ganhyuk. Embedded inside, that rock was metal. It wasn't iron, and it wasn't copper. It was dark, lackluster, and heavy. Ganhyuk flipped the chunk over in his palms, trying to scratch at it with a blade. The blade didn't leave a mark, so he held it up over the blaze. Yet the metal's color didn't shift at all in the heat. It didn't glow red, nor did it turn orange. It just stayed totally black. Ganhyuk actually recognized this kind of metal. Back in the Chan clan's archives, he devoured pretty much every text he could get his hands on. One particular volume was ancient, having been copied 3 separate times from a battered original. It made note of dark chromite, an incredibly scarce element used for blending which served as the core for mythical alloys used to smith weapons. A millennium ago, just a single kilogram of this dark chromite commanded a price of 100 gold coins. Finding a lone vein of dark chromite, was worth way more than the total yearly revenue of an ordinary house. Hyuk stared down at the fragment, then glanced up at Dulsway, demanding to know the exact spot where he dug it up. Dulsway guided him straight to the place, the second shaft, roughly 200 meters past the opening, embedded 2 meters inside the left-hand wall. Hyuk examined the rock face, pressing his open hand flat against it. He triggered his special ability, though not for mending stuff. This ability let him detect the presence of metal right through the stone, albeit faintly and indistinctly. But it totally worked. He felt a vein. It ran deep into the heart of the mountain, stretching far and wide, thick as an arm. Hyuk pulled his hand away, resting by the wall, while Dalsoy watched him closely. He asked what kind of metal they were dealing with. Hyuk replied in a quiet voice. Black chromite. Dulvi let out a low whistle. Then, he muttered that. It kind of explained why the mine got shut down. Someone either knew or had a hunch, closing it up so nobody would keep digging deeper. Or maybe they just missed it entirely, because they were only hunting for iron, not chromite. The iron sat much higher up, while the chromite was further down. Who'd keep digging when the stuff they actually wanted was right on top? Hyuk realized black chromite changed the whole game. With this material, he could forge weapons that no rival clan could ever duplicate. Yet black chromite also meant serious attention. Way too much attention if word ever got out about a vein of black chromite hiding in the Chagak mine. It wouldn't be merchants heading this way. It's going to be an entire army. He warned Dalsoy that absolutely nobody could know. Not a single soul. Dalsoy gave a firm nod, insisting he wasn't stupid. Sure, he was getting old, but he wasn't some blabbermouth. Hyuk sealed off the vein's opening, blocking it completely with heavy stones, and smoothing over the surface with clay. From the outside, it just looked like standard rock. The chromite would stay hidden for the time being. He went right back to blacksmithing, but now he mixed a tiny pinch of it into his blades. Just a minuscule amount of black chromite, blended into the alloy during the melt. A mere 10 grams for every kilo of steel. Nothing more was required, since the chromite acted as a catalyst. It transformed the metal structure on a microscopic level, making it way more dense and tough. Without making it fragile at all, steel infused with chromite felt kind of live. It absorbed a heavy blow and bounced right back, snapping back to its original shape instead of snapping. It wouldn't dull, and it wouldn't rust either. Gainiac crafted his very first chromite blade right at daybreak. It took quite a while, about 8 hours, Chromite demanded a completely different heat level, roughly 180 degrees Celsius hotter than normal. An ordinary forge just couldn't crank out that kind of heat. But Ganyao relied on the method of the original craftsman, the one whose artifacts he had mended. A dual-intake airflow system with a shifting cadence. The bellows operated just like a pair of lungs, breathing in, breathing out, in and out. The temperature skyrocketed, and the embers glowed white-hot. Yuri mentioned that the heat felt totally different, that she could actually feel it radiating against her skin, even from back in the hallway, and that the furnace seemed to breathe in a whole new way. The blade came out pitch black, but not from soot or scales. The alloy itself had darkened, carrying a rich, matte luster, resembling a midnight sky without stars. Ganyat raised it toward the light, yet the edge didn't reflect it at all. It drank it in. He gently traced his fingers over the flat. Incredibly sleek, flawless, without a single defect. Not even a hint of texture could be felt on it. He balanced it in his hand. It felt lighter than standard steel, even though the blade itself was visibly thicker. He slammed it hard against the anvil. The block vibrated with a ring, but left no scratch on the metal. Ganyak stared down at the piece. This wasn't some tool for a local Chadwan hunter. This was the sort of gear that high-ranking generals buy, that legendary figures wield, and that sways the course of entire wars. And he crafted it all alone in a cave, using a talent that everyone else thought was useless. Yuri wondered why he was being so quiet. Ganyak told her he was just thinking. Yuri asked what about. Ganyak said he was wondering how much this blade would fetch, and how certain price tags don't just bring in regular buyers, but predators. Rumors about the blacksmith from Chalgok had gotten to the Chan clan by the end of March. Ganyak didn't find out from spies or informants, though. He actually heard from Yuri. She was waiting by the mine entrance like she always did, expecting him to return from Chadwan. But as he walked up, she didn't even smile. She told him that while he was gone, a couple of guys had shown up. Young, built, wearing matching outfits with an emblem on their chests. The Chun clan crest, a white hammer on a black background. They demanded to know where the blacksmith was. Yuri told them he wasn't around. They checked out the entryway, tapped on the rocks, and one even peeked inside, but didn't go in. Then they both headed back down the trail. Cognac listened, his expression completely blank. Yet his right hand tightened up, around the handle of the hammer on his belt. He asked what they'd said to each other. Yuri replied that they hadn't said all that much. One mentioned to his buddy that the mine looked pathetic, but the other shot back that the swords weren't lousy at all, and that their older brother was going to be pissed. They had no clue. Yuri could hear better than any normal person could see. They kept their voices down, but to her, there was no such thing as quiet. A couple of weeks went by without any trouble. Hyuk kept forging and selling, just crafting away as time passed. He'd started crafting way more than just swords. Axes, spearheads, and hunting knives. Every single piece had a dash of chromite in the blend, making each one significantly superior to the clan's factory-made gear. The queue outside the Chordwan shop just didn't shrink. The old boss even took on an assistant to manage the crowd. But then, exactly what Hyuk expected finally went down. The suppliers over in Chorwan suddenly cut off his raw materials. All at once, out of nowhere, in a single day. Leather for the sheaths, wood for the grips, tempering oil, ropes, stuff like that, everything. Hyuk headed over to the tanner's place. The guy avoided his gaze, claiming he was fresh out. Yet Hyuk spotted the hides sitting on the racks behind him. The leather worker insisted that those hides were already spoken for. Every last bit. Hyuk then paid a visit to the oil vendor. Same deal there, the oil was right there, but it had been bought up. By who exactly? Can't say. Hyuk put the whole picture together. The Chan clan didn't launch an open attack. They didn't make threats. They chose an easier route. They simply starved his supply chain. They commanded every local vendor around not to sell a single scrap of resources to the smith from Chagak, and anyone who crossed them would see their clan contracts completely canceled. To the small-time traders in a remote outpost like Chorwan, a deal with the Chan clan means survival, you know? Nobody was going to take that gamble. Hyuk made his way back to the mine. He took a seat by the hearth, lost in thought. Without leather, you can't make a sheath. Without oil, you can't harden the blade. No wood means no hilt can be made. Sure, he could smith the blades, but a blade without a hilt is just a half-finished job. Yuri silently took a seat right next to him. She waited patiently because she could tell whenever her brother was deep in thought and knew better than to disturb him. An hour later, Hyuk finally stood up. He headed over to the third tunnel, the one leading straight down. Dalse had already warned him that the lower level was dangerous, mentioning cave-ins and toxic air. But Hyuk wasn't actually going down there. He stopped halfway down the slope, right by the wall. He noticed something here a week ago, but hadn't really thought much of it. Roots. A tree had forced its way through the rock from above. The roots were incredibly thick, ancient, and strong. Hyuk sliced one off and began shaping it. The wood was dense and remarkably springy. With its long grain, it was perfect for handles. He discovered the oil inside a wide cave, right where the second and third tunnels intersected. It was mineral oil, oozing from the stone in a thin layer. Gathering it took quite a bit of time, but it was doable. About half a glass accumulated each day. In a week, that was enough to temper 10 blades. Instead of using leather to make scabbards, he started crafting them out of wood. He used root wood, charred and then soaked in the mineral oil. The final product was rougher than leather, but way tougher, and the hunters really appreciated it. These wooden sheaths didn't get soaked. They didn't rot, and they didn't rip. Hyuk found a way out of every single trap his clan faced. Dalse just shook his head, remarking that the boy was sturdier than the mountain rock itself. Even that stone shatters, but he doesn't. Right around the end of the third month, Chunmyeon finally arrived in Chalgok. The elder brother, Hyuk, was near the forge when he caught the sound of footsteps. Heavy, full of confidence, with metal clanking at every single stride. Muyeon was wearing a utility belt, packed with tools, kind of like how others tote weapons. A hammer slung on his back, pliers right on his hip, and chisels across his chest. He stepped into the fourth chamber and came to a halt. He glanced at the forge, then at the anvil, and at the swords resting against the wall. As for Hyuk, he just watched his brother. For 2 whole years, he'd been cleaning up the forges Muyeon worked in. For 2 straight years, he hauled coal for his workshop. For 2 long years, he'd overheard his big brother telling the other masters that the younger sibling was only good for sweeping the floor. Muyeon stayed quiet. He'd expected to find something pretty pathetic. Shoddy craftsmanship, warped blades, and a rusted-out forge. Instead, what he saw was a workspace, small, unpolished, but fully operational, with swords lining the wall that looked solid. Even from afar, he walked right over to the wall, picked up a blade, flipped it over, inspected the steel, and ran his finger along the edge. Flicking the blade with his fingernail, he listened closely to the ring. Gang Hyuk caught the shift in his brother's expression. How sheer scorn turned into utter shock, and how that shock shifted into something else entirely. Something a lot like anger. But it wasn't anger, it was worse, fear. Muyan set the sword down and faced Gang Hyuk. He told him he had to head back, saying their father had demanded it, and that if he came home willingly, the brand of a deserter would be wiped away. They'd set him up with a workshop on the estate, along with all the materials and assistance. Pretty much everything he'd need. Ganyok just asked for one promise. Yuri Wayan stayed silent. Then he mentioned that Yuri was strictly off limits. She'd always been a total burden, and nothing had changed. Gan Hyuk just gestured toward the exit without saying a word. Muyan didn't even flinch or show any emotion. His face flushed, his jaw tightly clenched. He told him Ganyok just didn't get it, that the Chan clan wasn't making a request. The Chan clan was giving him a warning. If Ganyok didn't come back on his own, their next visit was going to look a lot different. Ganyok turned back toward the mountain. Keeping his back to his brother, he grabbed the tongs, yanked the glowing metal straight out of the coals, set it down on the anvil, and raised his hammer. He struck. The metallic ring echoed right through the tunnel. He kept right on forging, his back still turned to his older brother. Every single strike served as his reply. Mine just stood there watching for a minute or two, maybe 3, before he finally turned around and walked away. His footsteps gradually faded down the tunnel, heavy, rushed, and full of anger. Yuri stepped out from the living quarters. The moment those footsteps died away, she asked if he'd finally gone, and Konyak told her that he had. Yuri then asked if he'd be coming back. Kanyak said he definitely would, just not by himself. Yuri nodded, and then she mentioned that, while Mayan was standing over by the swords. His breathing had completely shifted. He started breathing much faster, kind of like someone who'd just spotted something he couldn't accept. Kanyak kept on forging, hit after hit. The metal block flattened out, drawing further out, slowly taking its shape as he mulled over what Mayan had told him. The clan doesn't ever ask. The clan gives a warning, which meant the next phase was going to be tougher. Higher guns, or worse. He needed some real protection. Not defensive walls, not guards. Weapons. Weapons. The kind that would force anyone coming with bad intentions to just turn right around. Konyak set aside his usual project and retrieved a chunk of black chromite, about the size of 2 fists, from his stash. He tossed it straight into the forge and started heating it up. Yuri could feel the intensity. By daybreak, the blade was finished. Way hotter, you know? She asked him what he was making, and Kanyak gave a brief reply. Something special. He kept hammering all night. Chromite demanded temperatures that would easily melt standard steel. 1600 degrees. Inside the hearth, the embers glowed white-hot. Dalsvi worked the bellows, muttering under his breath that the crazy fire was eating up all the oxygen, and they'd all be suffocating pretty soon. Kanyak ignored him, completely tuned into the metal. The chromite sang a lone note as it warmed up, a muffled sound like distant thunder. Yuri stayed in the corridor, well away from the heat, just listening. She mentioned later on that the metal had been speaking through the night, insisting she'd picked up 3 distinct voices. The strike of the hammer, the drone of the fire, and the melody of the raw metal itself. 3 separate sounds, all locked into a single rhythm. By daybreak, the sword was finished, forged entirely out of solid black chromite, a masterly blend of 6 different secret methods. From his first mentor, he adopted the heat management. From the second, the cadence of the hammer strikes. From the third, the precise bevel angle. From the fourth, the quenching style. From the fifth, the ultimate polishing routine. And from the sixth, the specific process for shaping the blade's edge. 6 masters, 6 lost methods, all forged into one edge, a blade pitch black as night, heavier than solid steel, yet even slimmer. The metal didn't reflect any light. Its hilt, crafted from burl wood, was bound tightly with strips of rawhide, stripped from a wild mountain goat that Dulfe had bagged a week prior. Jinhak carried the weapon outside. He stood right before the mine's opening. He lifted it high, then brought it down. He plunged it straight into the stony ground. The edge sliced into the boulder like it was just water. A fracture ripped right through the path, long and deep, stretching 3 meters. Gunny Hug wrenched the sword back out. Checking the steel, he saw there wasn't a single scratch. He headed back inside the mine. He jammed the blade into a cleft by the entryway, pointing straight out. The dark steel set against gray rock looked kind of like a threat, like a personal calling card. Yuri asked what that noise was. Gan Hyuk replied that the ground had split open. Yuri asked what could have caused that. Gan Hyuk answered that it was the work of the sword. Yuri went quiet for a second. Then she noted it'd make a great bargaining chip. The hired guns showed up 10 days after Muon's visit. 8 guys, and Gon Hyuk already knew they were coming. Dulsui spotted them tracking up the mountain path, a whole hour before they got close. He hurried down into the shaft and warned. Company's coming, heavily armed. Not hunters, either. Hunters usually pack alone or in pairs. 8 dudes carrying weapons is a whole squad. Gunhyuk told Yuri to head to the back quarters and stay put, and Yuri didn't argue at all. She recognized that tone, dead quiet, composed, without a single wasted word. That's how her brother always talked, whenever things got really serious. And then she left. Dulsui stood right by Gunhyuk at the entrance, clutching a mended pickaxe in his hand. Gunhyuk glanced at him and told him to get lost, saying it wasn't any of his business. Dulvi just spat, barking back that it was his mind and his problem, and that he'd been working here since before Gunhyuk was even born. He added that if anyone wanted to wreck his mine, they'd have to go through the old miner first. Meanwhile, the mercenaries marched up the path and came to a halt right outside the entrance. Their captain was a massive guy, with a huge axe slung over his shoulder. A real pro, a mercenary hunter, you know? It definitely wasn't the first time he'd done this kind of dirty work for the clans. He sized up Gon Hyuk, who looked like a mere boy, barely 17, kind of scrawny, wearing a leather apron, and holding nothing but a blacksmith's hammer. Hardly a warrior. Then he looked at Dulsui, just some old-timer with a pickaxe. Not a warrior either. The mercenary leader smirked, stating they were ordered to shut down this bootleg operation, claiming the mining permits were never processed, and that running a forge without a clan license was strictly forbidden under imperial law. He insisted they had a warrant from the local magistrate, and flashed a scroll, but Ganymede didn't even bother looking. He already knew the decree was totally fake. This mine belonged to his mother, and he had the actual deed right in his pocket. Besides, a smithing license was only needed in cities, with a population of over 10,000 people. Chortawan barely had 4,000. But those mercenaries didn't give a damn about the law. They'd come to wreck the place, but Gunhyuk just stepped aside. He, showing off a dark blade hidden in the gap by the doorway. A chromite sword, pitch black against the pale stone. The hired guns stared right at the weapon, and then shifted their eyes to the split in the dirt. A solid 3 meters deep, you know? The veteran merc scowled, moving a bit closer to inspect the fissure. Looking back and forth from the crack to the steel, he reached out his hand. Gunhyuk gave a simple warning, don't. Their captain froze and locked eyes with Gunhyuk. There wasn't a hint of panic in the kid's face. Absolutely nothing, not even a bit. Something felt way off. A 17-year-old metalworker was standing up to 8 armed killers. Without flinching, he's either totally clueless or he knows something they don't. The boss glanced over at his crew, who were also transfixed by the blade and the deep trench. One of them muttered under his breath that weapons like this shouldn't even exist, mentioning how he'd handled swords from the Chan family, the Kim house and the Beck line, and none of those could split solid rock like that. The captain hesitated. The bounty was a solid 130 gold coins. Great cash, sure, but money's useless when you're dead. He demanded to know Gang Hyuk's identity. When Gang Hyuk answered, the old-timer scoffed. Chan? As in that Chan bloodline. So to family feud. He hadn't signed up for stuff like that. Frightening some arrogant rookie was one thing, but getting caught in the middle of a brutal war between rival blacksmith factions was another. Facing his crew, he told him the payout wasn't worth the danger. They spun around and walked away. 8 sets of boots fading down the trail. Dulvi let out a huge breath, gasping that his heart had pretty much stopped. Meanwhile, Gon Hyuk just stood there frozen, keeping his eyes on the retreating mercenaries. And then he drew the blade from the crack. He flipped it around in his hands. A dark weapon that had saved their lives. It wasn't Gon Hyuk, and it wasn't prowess. Just the blade, pure and simple. Heading inside, he found Yuri waiting in the quarters. She was resting on a small cot, with her hands resting tightly on her lap. Her knuckles had gone completely white. She asked if they were finally gone. Ganya confirmed it, letting Yuri let out a sigh. Then she mentioned catching their voices. All 8 of them, you know? And she'd heard one guy bring up the fracture. Noticing how his voice kind of shook, Gon Hyuk took a seat right next to her. They just sat in silence for a bit. Then Yuri softly murmured that she didn't want him dying on her account. She said if it was safer for him to head back alone, he should just go, and that she'd get by. Ganiak placed a gentle hand on her head, telling her they're going to make it through here together. Yuri stayed quiet, but she leaned in closer. 3 days after those soldiers for hire moved out, a girl slipped into the mine, petite, thin, covered in grime, maybe 14 years old. Ganyak didn't spot her right away. She had sneaked into the second shaft, while Dulsui was down on the lower tier. And while Ganyak was busy forging, she swiped 3 chisels and a mallet right off the workbench. Tucking the tools under her arm, she scrambled back toward the entryway. Yuri caught the sound of unfamiliar steps. Delicate, swift, and real stealthy. It wasn't Dulzway, and it wasn't Ganyak. There was someone else. She called out, raising her voice, saying that a child was there, was waiting right by the second tunnel's entrance. And some metallic stuff was clinking inside their jacket. With every single step, the young girl completely froze. Ganya spun around and caught sight of her, skinny, wearing ragged clothes, and totally barefoot. Her eyes looked kind of furious, yet terrified. She was hugging the equipment tightly to her chest, glaring at Ganya like some kind of trapped animal that was ready to bolt or bite. Kinyak walked over, reaching out his hand, not to grab the gear, though. He just extended it, but the girl jumped back. When he asked her name, she didn't say a word. He asked if she wanted some food, and while she kept quiet, her stomach did the talking. Quite loudly, Kanyak gave Yuri a nod, and she pulled out some rice, along with jerky from their pack. They heated it up over the coals, and Kinyak set the dish down right before her. She glanced at the meal, then at Kinyak, then back at the food. Suddenly, she snatched the bowl and started scarfing it down, eating so greedily that she kept burning her mouth. Kinyak gently retrieved his gear from her coat. She didn't fight him since her mouth was stuffed. Once the bowl was totally wiped clean, the girl used her sleeve to clean her face, and mentioned that her name was Yin Sebyak. She claimed she was actually 16, not 14, explaining she was just tiny, because she hadn't eaten right for the last 3 years. She said she came from Chorwan. Her folks were both gone. She just crashed wherever she could find a spot, and she'd only wanted to hawk the equipment, because she was starving. Ganrak heard her out, then inquired if she knew how to work. Sebiak just scoffed, saying she could handle anything, stealing, scrapping, or running. Conceal. Ganiak made it clear she'd work with her hands. Sebiak glanced down at her palms. Tiny, scratched up, and with broken nails. She insisted she could handle manual labor too. Ganiak assigned her to work the bellows, forcing air right into the furnace. It was tedious, grueling labor for a kid. Sebiak kept pumping. The first hour went okay. The second slowed down, and by the third, she barely managed. Her arms were shaking, and she was drenched in sweat. Yet she wouldn't quit or even ask for a breather. She just kept pumping, gritting her teeth in anger. Like those bellows were some enemy she had to crush. Dulzway watched her and quietly shook his head, muttering to Ganyak that the girl was out of her mind. Stubborn as a young mule, Ganyak stared at Sebiak. He was seeing a reflection of himself 2 years back, cleaning out horns in the Chung clan shops. Nobody requested it, and nobody says thank you. But he pushes through because if he stops, he's admitting his craftsmanship is totally worthless, and giving in to that means throwing in the towel. He told Sebiak she could stay and get to work. She'd get meals and a place to sleep. Sebiak gave him a skeptical look, demanding to know what he expected in return. Ganyak simply replied, leather. He required someone to manage the leather work. Sebiak mulled it over for a second, then nodded. Yuri smirked from over in her corner, noting that there were finally 4 of them now. She said this place wasn't just a mine anymore, but an actual community. Dulzway just grunted, arguing that it's only a community if there's a bathhouse. For now, it's just a dump. Yeah, but a dump with some excellent ore. Later that night, Kong Hyuk rested on his cot and listened. Dolsu was snoring away, while Yuri breathed steadily. Sebiak was tossing and turning, kinda unused to the cot's sense. She always slept on the ground. For folks in a deserted mine, a smith with a scrap-dealing skill, a blind girl, an old miner, and a street urchin thief. No clan would bother with them. No guild, and no workshop. They were complete nobodies. But they had a forge, an anvil, and ore, plus a skill that turned out way different from what anyone expected. By the 4th month, that was plenty. Ganyak fixed up everything he'd found throughout the upper levels of the mine. 71 items total, tools, weapons, and household stuff. Everyone shared what they knew, each teaching something. But the final 10 pieces didn't offer much. Just mass-produced stuff, simple methods. Nothing new. The skill was starving. It needed older, more intricate, uncommon material. So then Kanyak decided to head down to the lower level. Dalsfei was totally against it. He said that deep tier wasn't shut down for nothing. Cave-ins, bad air, flood, stuff like that. He'd worked this mine 40 years back, and only braved the lower level twice. Both times, he almost died. The first time, a boulder crashed half a meter from his head. And the second time, he fell waist deep into a subterranean creek, and nearly drowned. It's pitch black down there, damp and dangerous. Konyak listened, nodded, and headed straight down the 3rd tunnel. It sloped sharply, the tracks had been ripped out, and rough steps were cut into the stone, but had eroded over the decades. Kanyak advanced cautiously, trailing a hand on the wall, while gripping a torch with the other. With a hammer at his hip, the atmosphere shifted with every step. It grew heavier, kind of sticky with moisture. The scent transitioned, the iron and mustiness faded, and a fresh aroma surfaced, a deep, mineral smell, almost like the stone itself was breathing. After heading down about 100 meters, the passageway finally flattened out. Kanyak stepped out into a cavern he'd never seen before. A massive vault, its ceiling completely swallowed by the dark. The torchlight only managed to catch the floor, and the lower sections of the walls. The ground was slick with puddles, as water droplets dripped from above. He skirted the perimeter, keeping his right hand on the rock, tallying his paces. The chamber was pretty vast, 60 paces across, 40 paces wide. The roof loomed 10 meters overhead, maybe even higher towards the back. Right at the far edge lay a cave-in, a massive one. Boulders the size of a person, someone or something, had intentionally brought the roof crashing down. A long, long time ago, you know? Definitely not just 40 years back. The debris was coated in mineral crusts. Centuries old. Kanyak neared the collapse and pressed his hand flat against it. His perception flared in response, though barely audible, just like a faint murmur. There was definitely something past the debris. His sense detected an object, a massive, ancient thing, terribly ruined, yet incredibly sophisticated. The impressions arrived in bits and pieces. Metallic, but it wasn't iron, nor copper, nor chromite. It was something else, stuff Kanyak didn't recognize, had never run into, and had never read about. His ability couldn't identify the item. Through the stone wall, since it was too far, and way too ruined, but he could still sense it. And that sensation felt kind of like a scream, almost like a calling. Genghis pulled back his hand, memorizing the exact location for the time being. He wasn't going to clear away the debris right then. The rocks were just too massive. He required gear, manpower, and plenty of time. He'd definitely return, just not at this moment. As he made his way halfway back to the room's exit, he spotted something near the wall, a tiny object partially buried under the rubble. Ganyak crouched down and brushed away the stones, revealing a miniature hammer, light enough for a kid. The handle was crafted from pale wood that had darkened over the years, and the head was minuscule, maybe 2 fingers wide and covered in rust. Even so, the form was completely recognizable. It wasn't a tool for mining. It was a blacksmith's hammer, made for a child. Someone had crafted a tiny hammer meant for small hands. Gunyak scooped it up, testing its weight in his hand, like maybe 100 grams or even less. He triggered his skill, and the radiance flared up instantly, way brighter than usual. With a warm heat, the rust dissolved away. The wood brightened, and the hammer beamed, compact, tidy, and flawlessly crafted. And right along with that radiance came insight. It wasn't about the temperature or the alloy's makeup, nor the cadence of the smithing, or the tempering process. Instead, a name surfaced. Chan Suhi, his mom. She had forged this tiny tool right here in this very mine, 12 years ago, for a 4-year-old boy. For him, the realizations washed over him in waves. His mother had stood by a small hearth in the upper vault, the exact spot where Gang Hyuk had discovered her workstation. She was warming up a tiny bit of metal, gripping it ever so carefully with tongs, tapping it softly with the hammer, so precisely, with a kind of gentleness you just can't find in blacksmithing. Yet she pulled it off. She poured love instead of force into every single strike. Her craft showed this without any words, just with a certain warm sensation. Not from the heat of the forge, though. A completely different sort of warmth. Human warmth. She really wanted her son to be a blacksmith, too. She crafted him his very first hammer, a little one, just right for small hands to hold tight and strike with. Along with a tiny anvil she was also planning to forge. But she simply ran out of time. They dragged her away to the Chan family estate back then. That little hammer was left behind in the mine, where it waited for 12 long years. Gang Hulk sat right on the tunnel floor, a stone floor, chilly and damp, cradling the small hammer in his massive hands. His hands weren't shaking, they didn't even budge. He just stared at the little hammer, and at the tiny anvil his mom had crafted for him, back when he was 4, when she was still around. Back when anything was still possible. The torch sputtered and popped. Droplets trickled from the ceiling in a steady rhythm, sounding just like a hammer hitting an anvil. Then came footsteps, light and cautious. A hand guiding along the wall. It was Yuri. She had made her way down all by herself, alone, heading down the steep tunnel slope, tracking her paces and feeling the rock wall. She had followed him down here, gonna find out why he'd been down so long, since she'd started to get worried, and she tracked him down just by the sound of his breath. From the dripping water and the silence. Where the clink of the hammer was gone. It was clear he wasn't working, so something was up. Yuri took a seat beside him, asking nothing, seeing nothing. She just sat down right by his side. As their shoulders touched, she stayed quiet. He was quiet too, and then Yuri uttered a single word, Mom. It wasn't a question, but a statement. She just knew. Hyuk answered with that same single word, Mom. Yuri rested her head against his shoulder. The small hammer rested in his palm, while the horn crackled above them. Water dripped from somewhere in a long, warm, comforting silence. Then Yuri softly remarked that the little hammer made a gentle sound. She said when Ganya held it. She caught a single, brief ring from it, kind of like it was saying hello. Hyuk gripped the hammer tight. A small, sturdy tool cradled in his large hand. His mother had given him his very first hammer. The world called his skills total garbage. But his mother had handed him that tool, long before he even knew what a skill was. Because to her, he was already a blacksmith at just 4 years old. No special skill, no system. Without the clan's blessing or stuff like that. Just a real blacksmith. They headed upstairs together. Hyuk led Yuri by the hand to the top floor, where Dalsoy was pacing around the entrance. He was grumbling about how they'd both vanished, saying he was just about to go down after them, and that he was way too old for this kind of stress. Then he noticed the little hammer in Hyuk's hand. He went quiet and just stared. He didn't ask a thing, while Sibio sat there by the bellows. As she kept pumping, she glanced over at Ganyok, staring right at his face before turning away. And she just kept on pumping. Hyuk set the small hammer down on the workbench, right beside his mother's gear. There was a hammer, some pliers, a few chisels, and now this little hammer. The whole set was complete, so he went back to the forge. He grabbed the metal piece and started hammering away, strike after strike. His rhythm was steady and powerful. Each strike felt like a response to his mom, to the whole world, and to himself. I'm right here. I'm shaping this metal, and I'm not going to stop. CBAP actually turned out to be quicker than she seemed. She spent 2 weeks working those bellows, pumping them consistently without a single complaint. Still, Ganyap caught on to what she was watching, and it wasn't the fire or the bellows. It was his hands whenever he was forging. Sebriak would just freeze up, totally forgetting to pump. The bellows would die down, and the forge would lose its airflow. When Ganyok whipped around, Sebjik jumped and grabbed the handle again, though her eyes stayed glued to the anvil. By the 3rd week, she asked him straight out, without beating around the bush. Could he teach her? Ganyok stared back, asking what she meant, and Sebjik replied, blacksmithing. Ganyok stayed quiet. This wasn't some simple request. In the Timu Empire, blacksmithing was a total privilege. Those specific skills only awakened once you hit 15. Without that awakening, a smith couldn't even control the magical fire, let alone carve runes. They couldn't infuse mana into the metal at all. Sebiak doesn't belong to a clan, and she hasn't awakened. She's got no special skills, no mana, and 0 access to any mechanism required for a smith's blade. A blacksmith's blade, she's just a regular person. And regular folks don't craft metal. They purchase them or just go without weapons. It had kind of always been that way. At least that's what the clan claimed. That's exactly how it was written down in the Imperial Register of Trades. A metal worker without any special talent is like a bowman who has no hands. Totally impossible. Kunhiok pondered for 2 days. Then he suddenly recalled his own gift. Master Blacksmith, everyone around considered him garbage. Just a D-rank utility type, meant for mending and fixing stuff. You know it's impossible to forge with that ability. Totally impossible to produce armaments. Impossible to ever become an actual blacksmith. Yet he stood there with 50 blades, vended by utilizing a gift that turned out to be something completely mind-blowing. Since everyone was certain it couldn't be done, but he was clueless, and that's why he pulled it off. Maybe Seebach is going to be clueless about limitations too. He beckoned her over to the metal block. He passed her a mallet, a rather small one. A light model, not his mom's tiny toy mallet. A proper tool for delicate shaping work. He commanded hits Seebach struck awkwardly feebly. The mallet ricocheted right off the metal piece, making more noise than actual impact. Ganyok adjusted her hand placement, her fingers, her wrist, and her elbow, her shoulder, every single joint. Each specific tilt, he told her once more. Seebach did better, but it was still pretty lousy. He guided her adjustments time and time and time again, lasting 4 hours for 200 hits. With every swing, Ganyao fine-tuned a single aspect, the alignment and the power. The point of impact, the rhythm. Seebach grit her teeth, her palms burning as her calluses tore, sending blood dripping right onto the anvil. She kept pushing, and by the end of the 4th hour, her swing had shifted. It wasn't quite perfect, but it felt right. The hammer came down squarely on the metal, rebounding cleanly with a single distinct ring, free of any rattling. Yuri shouted from her corner, confirming that final strike was good. Totally clean, without any side vibrations. Seabach stared over at her, at this blind girl, who could judge the quality of a strike. Better than a smith with 30 years on the job. Then she glanced at Gunyuk, at the kid with a supposedly trashy skill, who crafted weapons better than the clan's top masters. Finally, she looked at Dulzwa, the old-timer, who knew every single stone in a mine, that everyone else had completely forgotten. Sibiak grinned, muttering that they were a real fine bunch of scum. Gon-hyuk didn't smile, but his expression softened a bit. Every day, Gon-hyuk let Sibiak have 2 hours at the anvil. The rest of the time, she worked the bellows and helped out Dulzwa. Progress was pretty slow, lacking the actual skill. CBO just couldn't feel the metal like a true blacksmith would. She couldn't just read the temperature intuitively, nor could she see the steel's inner structure. By touch alone, she had to learn differently, with her eyes, with her ears, and through pure muscle memory. Gainiac talked her through it, showing her how. When the steel glows orange, it's 1,000 degrees. When it hits light yellow, that's 1,200. And when it goes white, it's at 14. Watch the color, commit it to memory. Don't try to feel it, just know it. Saborga picked it up pretty fast. She lacked natural talent, but she had anger, the raw fury of a starving kid, whom the world had written off as nobody. And that rage kept pushing her right through every blunder, through every bad burn, and every ruined piece that shattered under her clumsy strikes. By month 5, she'd finally made her first knife. It was tiny and crude, sporting a warp blade and a lopsided grip. Gon-hyuk took hold of it to check it out, testing the temper and tapping along the metal. A bit dull-sounding, poorly tempered. The left side's harder than the right, so the blade's gonna bend under pressure. The handle's way too thick, and the balance is off. He pointed out all the defects quite calmly, offering no judgment, just the plain facts. Then he added that, for a beginner's effort, it wasn't half bad. Sibik stared down at her blade, noticing the bent edge and the rugged handle, seeing every single flaw Kanyak had just mentioned. Then she gripped the weapon tightly and promised her next attempt would be way better. Kanyak gave a nod, knowing full well it would be. Meanwhile, orders at the shop were absolutely soaring. By that 5th month, Kanyak had cleared 80 swords, along with 30 axes and another 50 tips. 4 hunting spears. Total profits topped 500 pieces of gold. He grew the smithy, setting up a second hearth, getting another set of bellows, and building a storeroom for finished stock. Over in the main tunnel, Yuri organized a ledger system. Every single blade got its own serial number, production date, iron type, tempering style, and the customer's name. She kept it all in her head, tracking every digit, every date, and every client. Whenever a hunter walked in grumbling about a dull edge, Yuri would just ask them for the code. Whenever a hunter forgot, Yuri would just rattle off his order to him. The exact date, the size, the look, and the price. The guy's eyes would go wide. Yuri told them she'd log the issue, and that Kanyak would check out the blade. Pretty soon, the hunters actually grew to fear her. Just a little blind girl. But she remembers stuff, and you can't fool her. Dulvey remarked that they had the most bizarre manager on the whole continent. A 13-year-old blind accountant, who does math faster than the imperial treasurer, and who terrifies grown men carrying swords. Yuri just replied that there was no reason to be afraid. You just shouldn't lie, cause she'd catch it anyway. Around this time, something shifted with the ability. Kanyak was working on a bespoke sword for a hunter from some distant village. The fellow brought in a shattered blade, an ancient, once magnificent weapon, crafted by some anonymous master. The hunter explained that the sword was passed down from his granddad. The old man always said the steel was forged by a legendary smith whose name he'd forgotten. It had served him well for 30 years, until it snapped during a fight with a cave bear. The tracker wanted it fixed up. Kanyak took the weapon and triggered the skill. A bright glow, and the fracture sealed up. The corrosion vanished, and the iron hardened. But then, the magic pushed even deeper. A whole secondary layer, restoring it past its prime and going beyond, unveiling something brand new. The magic didn't just reveal what the blade used to be. It showed what the weapon was truly meant to become. What the smith intended 30 years ago. He'd picture it differently. Way better. He wanted a whole different angle for the edge. A unique shape for the guard. And a distinct curve to the blade. But you know the steel didn't set right. The temperature got too high, and the strike was off. The master wrapped up the work. But he well knew the sword didn't quite end up how he'd imagined it. Ganyok's skill recognized that original vision, spotting the exact gap between what had been crafted and what was actually intended. And so, it finished the job. The steel got reshaped, the edge angle was corrected, and the guard finally took the form. the master had held in his mind, stuff he'd just been unable to bring to life back then. The blade's curve became much smoother, longer, and kind of more elegant. The sword was completely transformed. It wasn't just a fixed-up blade anymore. It was the blade of his dreams, the exact one the master had wanted to build, the one that only existed inside his mind 30 years ago. And now, there it lay on Ganahawk's anvil, real and flawless. The third tier of mastery, restoration of the design. The hunter showed up 3 days later. He picked up the weapon and just stood silent for a long moment, before saying this wasn't really his grandfather's blade. It was something else entirely, something way better, honestly. He asked what Ganyak had actually done to it. Ganhyuk replied with just a single word. Fixed. And then the hunter left. Ganhyuk stood by the anvil, lost in thought. 3 levels of restoration, bringing it back to its true shape, restoring the actual intent. And right behind the debris down on the lower tier, an item lies waiting beyond what his talent can decipher. Ancient, shattered, and immensely powerful. Ganyak stared down at his palms, then glanced at his mom's little hammer on the table, and finally peered into the pitch-black tunnel ahead. Yuri walked over and asked what was on his mind. Ganya replied that he was pondering the depths. Yuri nodded, saying those depths could kind of wait. But supper definitely couldn't. Plus, he promised to clean the dishes yesterday, and never did. Ganhyuk just stared at her. Yuri stood there with her hands on her hips, 13 years old, unable to see, barefoot, and with metallic dust smudged on her cheek. Honestly, she was scarier than any clan leader. So, he went to wash the dishes. During the 6th month, a general showed up at the coal gok mine. Ganhyuk wasn't expecting him at all. He had no clue about him, nor had he heard his name. He was just hanging by the forge, shaping a metal blank for a 2-handed axe, when Dulzwei suddenly burst into the room. The old guy was completely winded, his face pale as a ghost. He gasped out that troops were on the path. 20 men clad in imperial armor, carrying the standard of the Southern Army, with a rider leading the way at the front. Ganhyuk put down his hammer. He stepped outside to find a mounted troop idling by the entrance. 24 soldiers in full battle gear, wearing chainmail and pauldrons, with swords at their waists and spears in hand. They looked exhausted, their gear coated in grime. They'd clearly come a long way. Up front, riding a chestnut horse, sat a large man around 50 years old. He was heavily built, with broad shoulders, a gloved left hand, and his right hand bare. He was missing 3 fingers on his right hand. Both the pinky and ring fingers were totally gone, and the middle one was cut off at the second knuckle. A deep scar sliced across his whole face from the left temple, passing over his nose right to his cheekbone. It was ancient, pale, and deep. His gaze was calm, yet incredibly heavy. The look of someone who'd witnessed so much death that he'd just stopped counting a long time ago. General So Yansik, the man commanding the Timu Empire's southern border. After 20 years of fighting demonic legions, stepping down from his mount, he neared Ganhyuk, staring straight down at him. Ganhyuk was big for a 17-year-old, but the general loomed even taller, broader, and much more massive. He didn't bother to give his name or offer a greeting. Instead, he unbuckled his belt, a standard infantry blade stamped with the Chan clan insignia. Just a basic assembly line weapon, which he held up before Ganhyuk. The edges of the blade were totally ruined, notched every couple of centimeters. The point was snapped off, and the steel had turned dark, not due to rust, but from bloodstains. The kind of demon blood that eats right through normal metal. The general mentioned this piece cost the military around 20 gold coins, and that his troops trash 300 of them every single month, meaning each ruined blade leaves a soldier completely unarmed and going weaponless down on the southern border. Makes you a dead man. With that, he dropped the sword into the dirt. It hit with a flat, hollow thud. Then he pulled a different weapon out from his saddlebag. It had no sheath, just wrapped up in a greasy rag. As he uncovered it, Ganhyuk instantly spotted his own craftsmanship from one of his very first batchmade runs. Specifically, number 23. Yuri would definitely recall the exact date and who bought it. The general lifted the blade to inspect it. The steel looked flawless, without a single scratch on it. No dents and absolutely no stains. It survived 3 separate clashes with demons. It still seemed flawless. The general bashed a boulder at the cave mouth, using that blade, and not gently either, with absolute power. A precise blow from a fighter with 2 decades of experience. The rock cracked wide open, but the edge stayed spotless, without a single nick. The commander then faced Ganyak, stating he required 10,000 matching blades by autumn, and made it clear this wasn't an option, arguing the nation demanded weaponry that wouldn't shatter, because his troops were falling, clutching broken steel in their hands. all since the great houses cheap out on defense quotas, given the returns are lower than on commercial deals. And that's exactly why those syndicates ship their absolute worst gear straight to the front lines, while keeping the premium stuff to sell off to rich hunters and collectors. Gainiac just processed it. 10,000 weapons by autumn. Over 4 months, making 2 a day gets you kinda 240 in total. Nowhere near 10,000. It's not even close. Meeting a demand like that requires way more than a shop. You need a massive foundry, scores of metalworkers, hundreds of tons of raw ore, and thousands of tons of fuel. Not to mention the supply lines, transit, and storage. So he explained to the officer it just couldn't be done. No lone craftsman could possibly turn out 10,000 blades in merely 4 months. The general didn't even flinch. He replied that he was well aware, which is why he didn't come with just a basic requisition. He brought actual funds, 5,000 gold coins as a down payment, with the remaining 5,000 due on completion. Backed by the state treasury, a fully authorized defense pact, stamped with the leader's own insignia, and endorsed by the war minister's signature. 5,000 pieces of gold. Gunyak had honestly never laid eyes on that kind of cash before. His entire revenue for half a year only came out to around 600 gold coins. 5,000. That was what a typical blacksmith clan made in a year. And with that kind of cash, he could take on workers, purchase gear, and set up brand new smithies. He could expand the mine, but it'd also bring a lot of eyes on him. Attention he just wasn't ready for yet. 10,000 blades for the Emperor's forces. Word would get out to every single clan, every local guild, and every weapons merchant across the realm. He wouldn't just be some kid from Forgotten Mine anymore. They're going to see him as a rival. A legitimate, highly dangerous threat. The kind of guy who has to be taken out no matter what. The general just stood there, waiting calmly. Biding his time was nothing new to him. Spending 2 decades on the frontier tends to teach you patience. Gon Hayuk glanced back at the mine behind him, staring into the dark tunnel and at the black blade wedged in the rock. Then at Dulzway, who was standing close by, clutching a pickaxe, and finally at Yuri, who had just come out from the shaft, and was lingering near the stone wall, barefooted, wearing nothing but a leather apron, with her head down, quietly listening in. Gon Hayuk had just a single question for the general. He wanted to know how many soldiers had lost their lives last month, simply because their weapons snapped. The general replied without a moment's hesitation, 212. Gon Hayuk went completely silent. 212 guys gone in 1 month because of faulty swords. All because those smithing clans keep cutting corners. And because a frontline soldier's life matters less than decent steel. He agreed to take on the job, on the condition that he could hire whoever he wanted. The general gave a nod of approval. Gon Hayuk stated that the blades wouldn't carry any official clan crest. They're going to be forged under the Koldok name. The general replied that he didn't care about the emblem. He just needed weapons that wouldn't break in battle. They shook on the deal. And the general mounted his horse again before heading out. He spun around and glanced right at Gon Hyuk. He mentioned he'd been hearing rumors about some kid with a garbage skill, crafting weapons that outclassed the big clans. He said he didn't give a damn about skills, ranks, or clans. He just needed results, you know? And if Gon Hyuk could actually deliver, the entire military would have his back. Besides, the army wasn't just those 5 blacksmith clans. The army represented the whole empire. Then he rode off, 20 horsemen, stirring up clouds of dust along the mountain path. Gon Hyuk just stood there at the entrance. Yuri walked up and waited right beside him, softly asking him what had gone down. Gon Hyuk replied that they were going to need people, a whole lot of people. So Yuri asked, just how many? Gon Hyuk paused to think. To forge 10,000 swords in a matter of 4 months, they'd require at least 20 blacksmiths, along with miners and some apprentices, plus a crew to smelt and purify all that steel, and others to assemble the hilts and scabbards. We'll need 50 people, minimum, he said. 50. Yuri gave a nod. Then she pointed out that Chortawan had 4,000 residents, and since half were jobless, finding 50 would be easy. Gon Hyuk stared at her, barely 13 years old, completely blind and standing without shoes on the rocks. Yet she talks about bringing on 50 workers, like she's just buying some rice for dinner. Dalsoy was standing close by, stroking his chin, and muttered that 50 wouldn't cut it. We need way more. This mine is massive. There's plenty of ore, and we could track down coal. But those tunnels have got to be widened, and we need to set up proper structural supports. Plus ventilation, man, that's a job for 100 people. Gon Hyuk nodded along. 100. Dalsoy smirked and brought up the fact that the last time 100 people actually worked this mine, that was 40 years ago. And knowing that Chaguk would kind of come back to life, the old man was thrilled. You could really tell his mind was waking up again. It took 3 weeks to sign up the crew. Kanyak headed down to Chodwan and put the word out that the Chagak mine was taking on miners, apprentices, porters, carpenters, and anyone else looking for work. The pay was 15 silver coins a day. Back in Chortawan, the usual rate was just 8 silver coins. A whole queue formed the very next morning. Dulsui handpicked the miners. He knew every single veteran miner in town. He knew who drank and who actually worked, who'd chicken out and who was steady down in the shafts. Within a week, he had signed up 30 men, seasoned miners, both older and tough. Ganhyuk chose the trainees. He didn't really need blacksmiths. There weren't any blacksmiths in Chortawan anyway. All of them worked for the big clans or in the major cities. He just needed extra hands, fast. Strong guys who were quick to learn. He lined up each applicant right in front of the forge, handed them a hammer, and simply told them, strike. He wasn't looking at their precision, nor was he checking their brute strength. He was watching out for one thing, rhythm. If a guy hit steadily and could keep the pace going, it meant he was going to be teachable. But if they lost the beat after 10 swings, then forget it. Out of 40 hopefuls, he picked 20. Yuri managed all the contract talks. Every single hired hand had to deal with her. She laid out the conditions, the pay dates, and the regulations. No stealing and no drinking on the job site, and no gossiping about stuff that goes on inside. She delivered that final rule very softly and deliberately. The crew nodded along, while anyone who wavered just walked away. Yuri then gave a heads up to a hesitant Ganhyuk. Calling them out by name, she said, skip these guys. Her sharp ears caught the slight hesitation in their breathing. Ganhyuk spent that whole first week getting things in order. The entire mine layout needed a total overhaul. The initial tunnel got converted into a storage depot for ore and coal. The second one remained the living quarters for Ganhyuk, along with Yuri, Dalsu, and Seabok. They turned the fourth chamber into the main blacksmith workshop. Ganhyuk set up 6 different forges, all in a line. That meant 6 anvils and 6 complete sets of gear. Every single forge was run by a 2-man team, 1 master blacksmith and an apprentice, working the bellows. Dalsway took charge of managing the excavation side. He had 30 miners working 3 shifts, running 24/7. They hauled the ore back up using fully restored mine cars. Meanwhile, Ganhyuk built the smelting station up on the surface, right by the main entrance. It featured 3 furnaces constructed from rock and clay. They were pretty crude but did the job, being fed from the top and emptying out from the bottom. Coal supplies were brought in straight from storage pits, and from above ground, too. Dalsway managed to find an exposed part of the coal vein, just 2 kilometers away, allowing for open pit mining. It was way easier than digging deep underground. Ganhyuk personally trained his new assistants, which honestly turned out to be the toughest part. See, not a single one of them knew anything about metalworking. None of them had ever handled metal before. They were just typical miners, farmers, and woodworkers, definitely not blacksmiths. So Ganhyuk guided them the exact same way Seebjok once taught him. No special techniques, no magical mana, and no formal system. Just hands-on practice, watching closely, and endless repetition. He taught them to judge heat by color. Orange means 1,000 degrees. Yellow is 1,200, and white hits 1,400. Keep your pacing steady, he'd say. Strike, then pause. Strike and turn. Don't overthink the hit. Your body kind of remembers before your mind does. The first couple of weeks were a total mess. The blank split, and the blades kept warping. The tempering was all uneven, and out of 20 trainees, only 5 could shape something that actually looked like a knife. The rest just ended up making junk metal. Ganhyuk didn't get mad, and he never shouted. He'd just walk over and take the student's hand, guide it right, and show them how to strike. Then he'd step back and keep an eye on things, fixing it again and again, over and over. Seebok pitched in too. She'd been learning way longer than the others, and knew every single blunder you could make. She showed the new guys what to avoid doing, like how not to grip the hammer, or how not to set up the metal piece, and why you shouldn't blow on the glowing iron, since it's just dumb and will singe your face off the boot. She knew that last part from first-hand experience. A mark on her left cheek, tiny and circular. She carried it like a badge of honor. By week 3, things had finally stabilized. 10 novices were getting consistent results now. Not amazing, just reliable. They managed to shape simple, straight edges, following the exact design Ganhyuk had set up. Standard length, standard width, standard depth, and standard tempering, without ever straying from the pattern. Ganhyuk checked out every single blade himself. He'd hold it in his hands and inspect it. He'd tap it, listening closely to the ring. And he threw out every third piece without a second thought. The learners grumbled, but Ganhyuk just told them one thing. Some guard is going to carry this weapon out on the southern frontier, and if it snaps in a fight, that soldier is dead. That shut down the whining pretty fast. Yuri handled the budget, but that 5,000 gold coin advance vanished pretty fast. Between wages, supplies, and gear, plus feeding 100 people, she did all the math in her head. Every single night, she'd give Kanyak the breakdown. What they spent, what they had left, and how much more they're going to need. Kanyak just listened and nodded. The figures looked bad. The funds were draining way quicker than he'd anticipated, though output was definitely ramping up. By the end of week 2, the shop was turning out 30 swords every day. They were basic, unpolished. Nothing fancy, but really solid. Each blade had a tiny bit of black chromite mixed in, which Konghak tossed in himself. Late at night, once everyone cleared out, he'd slip down to the hidden vein, break off a chunk of chromite, and grind it into powder to add to every batch. Just 10 grams per kilo of steel. That did the trick. None of the trainees knew anything about the chromite. They just assumed the high-grade steel came from that special refining method Konghyuk had shown them, which was true, kinda, except the chromite was what turned a decent blade into something that'd simply never snap. Come the 7th month, the shop's daily output hit 50 swords. Kanchak figured out a way to streamline things. A division of labor where one trainee cuts the raw metal, the next hammers out the basic form, a third handles the detailed finishing, a fourth tempers it, a fifth does the sharpening, and the sixth crafts the hilts. An assembly line setup. No clan had ever made weapons like that before. Clans always forged them one by one. Every smith worked from the ground up. It was a point of pride. The expert carves his name into the edge, handling every single step himself. Konchuk stamped it all with the Chulkov mark. A trademark, not a personal name. 'Cause these blades weren't crafted by just one guy. They came straight off an assembly line. 50 pieces daily, 1,500 a month. 9,000 over 4 months, 1,000 short. Konchak figured out the math. We got to push output to 60 a day. Add 2 more kills and 4 extra trainees. Dolphy mentioned the ore supply was solid. The deposit down the second shaft was massive. Plenty to keep us running for 2 full years. Plus open pit coal, plus all the iron. From old tracks that Ganyud kept recycling. The town of Chorwan was transforming. 100 pit workers were pouring cash into the area. Boutiques popped up and the pub brought on a chef. The marketplace was buzzing. The laborers' wives started washing and cooking stuff for the folks staying by the pit. Traders from nearby settlements rolled in, bringing textiles, hides, timber, and equipment. Everything required for the booming trade. Kodovin's headcount jumped from 4 to 6,000. In 2 months, Dulzway took a stroll through town and barely recognized the place. He noted Kodovin had been fading for 30 years, but somehow revived completely in just 90 days. And it's all thanks to a single kid, with a mallet and a knack for scavenging junk. Ganyak wasn't even paying attention. He just stood there shaping unique steel, not bulk weapons. The helpers handled that standard stock. He was busy crafting bespoke masterpieces, intended for General So's commanders. Forged from chromite steel, you know? Every single one tailored by hand. Blending methods from a bunch of different masters. 20 commander blades. The absolute peak of his work so far. He kept on studying through the night, fixing up random things. That Dulzway dragged out of the old tunnels. During the dig, every piece kind of taught him something. By then, Kunyak had successfully learned 47 distinct styles. 47. Departed masters had left their hidden wisdom with him. Through pieces of rusty metal. He was the lone smith across the land, who gathered knowledge from the dead. The initial batch of weapons headed to General Su. Around the 8th month, 3,000 swords packed away in wooden boxes, piled onto 12 separate wagons. The line of carts stretched for half a kilometer, winding down the mountain pass. The general's troops arrived to collect them. A 30-man guard, the commander, took charge of the load, tallied it up, and picked 10 random swords to test. He drew them out of the crate, gave them a look, and slapped the flats against a boulder. He checked the steel and slid it back in. After the 10th piece, he gave a nod, inked the document, and the line rolled out south. Konyak stood by the doorway, just watching. 3,000 weapons, 3,000 edges that, in a month's time, are going to be held by fighters. Down on the southern front, 3,000 of his creations would tear through skin, shatter bones, and slaughter monsters. Though maybe not just monsters, you know. Yuri stood nearby, keeping completely quiet. She could tell how he felt just by his breathing, like when he took steady, deep breaths. It meant he was brooding over something kind of heavy. She didn't press, she just waited. Kanyak went right back to work. The smithing never paused for even a single day. The workshop was running on 3 shifts. The pounding of the hammers never stopped, you know? Yuri had gotten totally used to drifting off, to the clanging of metal. She even mentioned, that the quiet actually scared her more than the noise now. By the second run, Kanyak had pushed production up to 65 blades a day for brand new forges, run by apprentices who'd finished his training. Sebok finally moved away from the bellows. Now, she was working the anvil as a real, full-on blacksmith, even without special skills or mana. Her weapons were just a bit rougher than Ganhyuk's. More basic, but solid. Each one passed the quality check. Not a single piece had been thrown out over the past month. Ganhyuk watched her and saw the living proof. You can actually smith without any system skills. You can craft weapons without relying on stats and stuff. The major clans had either lied or just been wrong. Or maybe they knew the truth and kept it under wraps. If Sebok could manage it, then anyone could. And if anyone can do it, then the clan's monopoly is nothing but a sham. That line of thinking was dangerous. Way more hazardous than black chromite. More threatening than 10,000 swords. Because chromite can always be confiscated, and weapons can be smashed to pieces. But the realization that smithing skills aren't essential, well, you can't destroy that. It's going to spread like a fracture through solid stone. Exactly a month after that initial delivery was dispatched, a message arrived from the general. Dalso delivered it all the way from Chorwan. An official envelope stamped with a military seal. As Ganhyuk unsealed it, Yuri asked him to read it out loud. General Su kept his letter short, in a typical military style. The blades have arrived safely and been handed out to the Southern Army's 2nd and 3rd Regiments. Our first clash took place over at Black Mist Pass. We took down 304 demons with just 11 losses on our end. During a pretty similar fight last month, we actually lost 47 men. That's a 4-fold improvement, all thanks to these swords. Not a single blade snapped out there. The troops already gave the weapons a nickname, Black Teeth, kind of matching the dark shade of the chromite steel. The general added that he's looking forward to the second delivery, and he's bumping up next year's order to 20,000. That's what Ganhyuk read. Yuri listened quietly before whispering that 11 lives are still 11 lives. Ganhyuk gave a nod. 11 soldiers had fallen while gripping his swords, but 36 others made it back because of them. The arithmetic of warfare is incredibly simple, brutal, and completely unforgiving. The next batch was shipped out within 6 weeks. 4,000 swords, along with 1,000 spearheads, and another 500 daggers. General Su sent over the remaining balance. Right with the caravan, 5,000 gold coins, plus a fresh agreement for the upcoming year. 20,000 swords, 10,000 spearheads, and 5,000 daggers. The grand total for the deal came to 25,000 gold. Yuri quickly crunched the numbers, noting that based on current overhead and output, their take-home profit for the year would hit 12,000 gold. Ganhyuk asked if that was considered a lot. Yuri pointed out that the Chan clan pulling in around 30,000 gold a year meant that after just 1 year of work, they'd rake in a full third of what that massive smithing clan makes. All from an old, abandoned mine with only 100 guys, relying solely on his very own smithing skills. Ganiak didn't say a word. Before mentioning that this was going to cause trouble, Yuri shot back that the trouble was already here, gesturing toward the entryway. Someone was standing right in the doorway. Definitely not a soldier, nor a hunter, nor a trader. He looked young, maybe 22 years old, with broad shoulders and hands scarred from working the forge. His dark eyes seemed heavy. A smithing hammer with a white pommel hung from his belt, the emblem of the white flame. It was Chan Mayan, the elder brother. He'd shown up entirely on his own, without mercenaries, without guards, without any sort of entourage, just completely alone. Ganhyuk stepped forward to meet him, and the two stood there facing each other. Mayan glanced toward the mine, at the smoking smithies, at the apprentices busy hammering away, at the carts loaded with, and at the storehouses packed with finished blades. There wasn't any rage or scorn on his face. It was something else entirely, kind of unfamiliar. Muyun drew a long, wrapped bundle from behind his back, and uncovered it to reveal a sword. It had a pale, slightly curved blade, fully engraved across its entire length. The white fang, his ultimate masterpiece. 2 years of labor, and the absolute finest piece he'd ever crafted. In fact, it was the greatest thing any young smith from the Chan clan had forged in over a decade. Muyun set the weapon down on a boulder right before Ganhyuk. He explained that he wanted to put it to the test, to break it, and then forge it anew if it proved better. If so, then he'd been wrong. Not just about how he viewed Ganhyuk, but about how he viewed absolutely everything. Skills, hierarchy, the whole system, and all the stuff he'd been told since the day he was born. If things don't look up, then life works exactly how they told him it did. And after that, Ganhyuk's going to shut down the mine. Ganhyuk stared down at White Fang, a flawless blade of white steel shaped in a blaze. raging at 2,000 degrees, born of Muyun's own craft. The fire of the White Star? No one can really pull off that kind of heat without it. Snapping it means destroying 2 whole years of his older brother's life's work. It's the ultimate disrespect one smith can ever show another. Yet Mayan is practically begging for it. Kang Hyuk raised White Fang, feeling its weight and ideal balance. A flawless edge, truly magnificent craftsmanship. Even so, he could sense the truth through his own talent. With his bare hands and the wisdom of 47 masters, whose memories and secrets lived on inside him, White Fang was absolutely breathtaking, but it wasn't quite perfect, and Mayan knew it. That's exactly why he's here. Kang Hyuk rested the blade across his knee. He pushed down, and the white steel fought back. He leaned in harder, forcing the metal to bend even further. Crack! White Fang shattered right in half. The sound rang out like a desperate shriek. Muyun winced, tightening his fists. His color completely drained, but he stood his ground. Kang Hyuk brought the broken shards into the smithy. Muyun stayed out in the yard, pacing back and forth. He'd sit down, then bolt right back up. He kept pacing, refusing to step inside. He just couldn't bring himself to. Dole's Way brought him water, but Muyun wouldn't take it. Siba kept an eye on him from around the corner, softly whispering to Yuri that her big brother looked just like a man, waiting to hear his final sentence. Yuri murmured back that he was indeed waiting. Meanwhile, Kang Hyuk toiled through the night. Initial restoration. His expertise bound the fragments back together. The white steel had seamlessly merged. The fracture vanished. Now, the second layer. The blade was brought back to its absolute prime, just like the moment Mu Yuan finished crafting it, and held it up against the light. The third layer, and that's when Gan Hyuk noticed it. Weon had actually pictured the White Fang differently. The arch was meant to be more profound, the handguard more nimble, and the edge slimmer by 0.5 millimeter. And above all else, the white flame was supposed to flow through the metal, not just thrice, but 7 times over. Yet, during the 4th cycle, the steel started losing its integrity. Terrified by this, Weon simply stopped. He wrapped it up right there, 3 cycles instead of 7. An exquisite weapon, sure, but not the true one from his visions. Gan Hyuk's mastery fulfilled that original blueprint. The 4th cycle, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. The white steel finally welcomed the fire that had never penetrated it before, even though it was always meant to. The curve grew deeper, the guard became more agile, the edge thinned out, and the weapon began to hum softly, a high pitch, kind of like a vibrating string. By daybreak, White Fang rested upon the anvil, the identical weapon, forged by the same creator, yet transformed, completed, perfected, genuine. Gan Hyuk carried it out into the open. Mu Yuan was waiting by the doorway. He hadn't slept a wink all night. His eyes were bloodshot. Gan Hyuk presented the blade. Mu Yuan accepted it, his hands shaking. He lifted White Fang toward the dawn sky and stood motionless. That was his blade, his own concept, his ultimate vision, the one he just couldn't realize. The dream he'd abandoned back during the 4th pass. 7 folds forged in white-hot flames. A deep curve, a lightweight guard. A slender blade. Absolute perfection. His own ideal masterwork, though he wasn't the one who forged it. Mayan gripped the sword, completely speechless. Tears began rolling down his cheeks, but he didn't even bother wiping them, totally oblivious. He just stared at the steel, the very thing he'd envisioned crafting for 2 whole years. And yet, his younger brother, with his kind of garbage talent, had brought it to life in a single night. Turning around, he started walking down the trail, moving silently with the weapon in hand. He didn't cast a single glance back. Gan Hyuk watched him recede while Yuri stood close by. She softly remarked that Mu Yan had been weeping. Gan Hyuk simply murmured that he was aware. Yuri wondered what could have brought him to tears. Was it pure resentment, or stuff like that? Gan Hyuk paused to consider for a second, then replied that it was because of the harsh reality. A month later, a delivery arrived from the Chan clan, bearing no return address and no message. Just a wooden crate secured tightly with twine. Stored inside was 5 poods of choice, top grade ore. The Chung clan typically reserved material like this, strictly for special commissions. Gan Hyuk pried the crate open. He inspected the mineral before glancing over at Yuri. Yuri inquired about what was inside. Gan Hyuk told her it was raw ore. Yuri then asked who had sent it. Gan Hyuk remained quiet, but they both already knew. By the time the 9th month arrived, the entire empire had heard the name Chalgok. It wasn't that Gan Hyuk was chasing after reputation, but rather that 10,000 blades meant 10,000 troops. And every single soldier shares that tale. Every single tale travels across the barracks, through the pubs, and in letters sent back home. Blades made in Chagak just don't shatter. Dark steel, lightweight, razor-sharp, everlasting. That word, everlasting, was what the troops kept repeating the most. The blades never lost their edge, they didn't rust. They didn't chip, they never needed to be honed. They didn't even need a wipe down. It's like the metal was looking after itself. Chromite, 10 grams for every single kilo. A little secret only Gang Hyuk and Dolsu shared. Sheer panic hit the imperial marketplace for weaponry. The Red Forge Guild was the very first to notice it. Kwon Tae-jin was sitting inside his capital office, going through the files. Sales of the family swords had dropped 12% this quarter. And it wasn't because Chagak was flooding the shops with bargain items or stuff like that. Their military deals were locked down tightly. Chagak manufactured exclusively for the troops. Yet the soldiers coming back from the front lines were carrying those black teeth back with them. They would show them off to their buddies. And those buddies showed them to everyone they knew. The hunting factions caught wind of it. Private mercenary outfits caught wind of it too. Even the high nobility heard the news. Everyone was craving the exact same gear. But Chagak didn't deal to ordinary folks, only to the armed forces. Massive demand without any supply kind of fueled the gossip. And that gossip ended up sparking total panic. The 5 great families started losing their accounts. Not up front, but in a roundabout way. Buyers kept asking, how come your gear gets blunt, while the stuff from that mine stays fine? Why does your iron corrode while theirs doesn't? Why should your piece cost 30 gold coins, when it's worse than what's going for 10? The clan masters were totally clueless, since the secret was just 10 grams of black chromite for every kilo of steel, along with 47 styles from late masters, and a specific method that everyone thought was garbage. Tae-jin made his second appearance in Chalgok. Gang Hyuk went out to greet him at the gate. Tae-jin wasn't grinning like he did on his previous trip. Back then, he was polite and putting deals on the table. This time, he was dead serious, dropping a grim warning. He mentioned that the 5 great clans were gathering for a summit, something they hadn't done in 8 long years. Gang Hyuk could easily figure out what they'd talk about. He noted that the clans wouldn't launch a direct strike, as long as Cholgok remained safeguarded by an active military deal. Dealing with the army is no joke, but that contract isn't going to last forever, and those clans are willing to bide their time. Kang Hyuk questioned why he was sharing all this. Tae-jin countered that his original offer was still open, an arrangement covering guild protection, logistics, and sales with some newly tweaked conditions. A 50% split instead of 60. Kang Hyuk simply declined. Tae let out a sigh, remarking that Kang Hyuk was just an unyielding mule, though he kinda respected stubborn mules, seeing as he used to be the exact same way 30 years back. He then glanced down at what was left of his right hand, falling silent for a brief moment. He admitted losing that hand was the price of his own stubbornness. He'd refused to listen when people screamed at him to quit, persisting with the forge even as the anvil horn split. A sudden fracture, a massive blast. And his limb, his livelihood, everything was gone. Facing Kang Hyuk, he confessed. He really didn't want the kid following that same path, adding that leaning on others isn't a sign of weakness, but a smart move. Kang Hyuk just took it all in, and then he mentioned he'd consider it. Tae-jin just smirked, saying he'd heard that same line half a year ago. Kang Hyuk shot back that back then. There wasn't really anything to weigh, but now there is. Then, Tae-jin took off. Kang Hyuk headed back into the workshop, sat down right by the forge and got lost in thought. Yuri walked over and asked what was on his mind. Ganya filled her in on the whole clan council situation. Yuri listened quietly, then asked what Tae-jin was actually after. Ganyuk replied, protection, but they want control in return. Yuri shook her head, insisting Tae-jin didn't care about control. He just wanted to be close by. She caught his tone of voice twice. Whenever he talked finances, he sounded completely steady, totally professional. But when the topic turned to forging, his whole tone shifted, becoming a lot softer, way gentler. Tae-jin isn't just some merchant looking for a cut. He's an old blacksmith who kind of wants to be near the mountains again. Ganyak just stared at her. Yuri could read people way better than those who actually had sight. Come the 10th month, Ganyak finally made up his mind. It wasn't about signing a deal with Tae-jin. It was something else. He started retailing weaponry, and not just to the military. He launched a whole second branch. A commercial line making blades for hunters, axes tailored for woodcutters, and everyday knives for the public, all at fixed rates. 10 gold pieces for a sword, 3 gold pieces for a knife, and 7 for an axe. That was a third of what the clans charged, yet twice the quality. Yuri warned him that this meant war. Gun Hyuk countered that the war was already well underway, ever since he sold that very first blade. At the old man's shop, things had just been escalating. That initial commercial batch cleared out in a single day. 500 pieces. Hunters traveled from neighboring regions, having queued up since the sun went down. So, Gun-hyuk brought on 50 extra workers. He grew the shop to 10 blacksmiths, 30 trainees, and 200 laborers. The Chagak mine was basically becoming a town. The upper tier was turned into living quarters. Bunks for the crew, a mess hall, and the bathhouse Dulsway had been begging for since day one. The mid-level was packed with hearths and anvils, storage areas, and melting pots. Ganya's own workspace sat apart in the fourth chamber. Just him in there, crafting custom blades. That's where he mended vintage gear, and where a table stood with his mother's. Old gear and a little mallet. Yuri was stationed in a separate room by the entry now. Her workspace held a desk, a chair, an accounting frame she never touched. Since doing the math in her head was way quicker, every single order went through her, plus all the billing and complaints. During all deals, the crew just called her the boss. Not behind her back, but straight to her face with real respect. This little blind girl memorized every figure, every name, and every commitment. You couldn't trick her. She caught the dishonesty in their breath, and the hesitation in their silence. At just 14, barefoot in a leather apron, she was the most dreaded bookkeeper in the realm. Gun-hyuk observed all this and reflected that he'd really just wanted to build a home, a shop, and a safe haven for his sister. Just a peaceful existence. Instead, he'd created an industry that's rattling the trade markets of the entire realm. 200 folks count on him. Thousands of troops wield his steel, and 5 noble houses are organizing a summit. The Grand Commander knows his name. The chief of the biggest merchant syndicate visits in person. Yet he still crashes on a stone cot inside the corridor. And Yuri still chews him out for dirty bowls.